我们开篇的第一个镜头的设计呢，基本上都是特写的局部的运动，
很长很长的一个移动，我们要求它有它的节奏，有它的复杂的焦点变化，要求摄影机的稳定，要求它的灵活度。
其实这个呢，对于机器的一些极端性能是有挑战性的，我们也是很值得期待的。
其实我们一直用3200的这个感光度，就是少用灯嘛。其实这么大一个摄影棚，用的灯很少。这么复杂的一个动作戏，还有这么多动作演员，动作也非常有难度的一个设计，居然2天我们能够顺利把它完成，其实跟我们用灯少、低照度的这个应用其实是分不开的。
来，不用那么亮，不用那么亮，后边这儿打一个。
其实这个机器呢，就是我们在它主要核心的性能指标都完善的这种情况下，其实最需要的做到，比如说小型化、轻型化，另外呢，它能更多的集成一些，就是简便的操作和能覆盖我们的创作的需求，还有一些特殊要求，你比如说这种自动焦点的配置，这个机器呢也是一种大胆的尝试，在这方面。也是有一些这种黑科技的元素在里边。
来开机。
好仔。
BURANO 这台机器呢，附加了很多不一样的功能，我还是对它有一定的期待。
我特别希望它做得特别的完美。
For me, wingsuit means, I would say, freedom. It's a tool I use to discover new places, like to open new jumps, to fly new lines. It's a passion, and I do it with love. This last 2, 3, 4 years, I like to do big jumps, so big approach, big mountains. The wingsuit change, we have now like super performant wingsuits. My past of gymnast is really inside me, and I can do acrobatic stuff, so I was like, why not doing that with a wingsuit? I fell in love of the feeling of flying my body in 3 dimensions and use my body to move forward to fly.
Okay, so great, thank you for coming. Great turnout, it's good to see so many of you. So really important thing is today is not for my benefit, it's for your benefit. So please don't be afraid to ask questions at any point. We will make some time for a bit of a Q&A session towards the end of the day, but very often I think if you have a question early on, by the time we get to 5 o'clock and you've been brainwashed with PowerPoint slides and everything else, you might forget what that question is. So don't be afraid to ask a question at any time. I really, honestly don't mind being interrupted with that. Hang on, you just said something I don't understand. Could you explain it again? Because probably if you don't understand it, you're not going to be the only person in the room that doesn't understand what I've said. So it's a really good point to say, actually, could you explain that a bit better? Because we don't understand. So do feel free to jump in and fire away. I'm actually going to start a little bit with the cinema line, because I think one of the key things for me as a filmmaker that is a real thing with Sony's ecosystem right now is that they do have this cinema line of cameras that starts with the FX30. Anybody here got an FX30? Other than me, there's a few hands gone up. What a great little camera. It really shouldn't be that good, actually. It's a really, really amazing little camera. But all of those cameras from the FX30 through to Venice 2 are using more or less the same color science. And that means you can mix and match these cameras within your production. And we've seen some amazing examples of what can be done with a camera like the FX3. There's the film The Creator shot on the FX3. But we're also seeing lots of examples of very high-end films where they're mixing perhaps a Venice 2 with an FX3 or an FR7 because there's a particular shot that they can't get with the Venice 2. They need something smaller or something remote and things like that. And they have the confidence to be able to mix and match the cameras from the cinema line, knowing that with a little bit of grading and after all your post-production work, it's going to be very difficult for the audience to tell which bits of the film were shot with which cameras. But looking at this slide that is in front of us right now, there is a gap between the FX9, which is really a kind of a broadcast workhorse camera, really. That camera is really sort of tailored for people doing a lot of broadcast productions. and your full-fledged Venice 2 cinema camera, which, you know, I'm not going to pretend that this is a cheap camera. We all, you know, this is an expensive piece of kit here. It's quite heavy. You do have the Rialto system on it that allows you to separate the head and do some really clever things with that, but it still remains a quite big, quite bulky camera, needs a lot of power and stuff like that. So there was a gap for something that sat between the FX9 and Venice 2, and that is, of course, Burano. Now I've got various slides. I'm going to skip through some slides here because I'm not going to... Now Venice and Venice 2 have an amazing pedigree at the high end now, shooting all sorts of really great films. Ferrari, which is now out on the streaming release. Gran Turismo, there's the new Brad Pitt's Formula 1 film that's currently being produced on Venice, a lot of films. And in a lot of countries now, across Europe certainly, Venice 2 is actually becoming the camera of choice for filmmakers. So one of the films that I've been working on last year that will be released later this year is Beetlejuice, which is a Tim Burton film. Director of photography on it is Haris Zambalakis. And he chose Venice 2 when he could have chosen any camera he wanted. And traditionally, Haris Zambalakis used to shoot on a Panavision System 65. And it was actually Haris that went to Panavision, I think it's about 8 years ago, and got them to resurrect the System 65 cameras so he could work with that really big format, film format. But what he found was, yes, System 65 is wonderful, but there are all sorts of logistical and cost implications where a magazine weighs 35 kilos just for the mag. Venice 1, he tried it, he liked it, but when he was shown Venice 2, it was like, wow, this is a camera that really is delivering the image quality that I want. And it has this huge color palette, this absolutely enormous color gamut. And that big color gamut allows you to make the camera look however you want. And it's one of the things that to some degree has gone against ARRI. There's so much discussion all the time about dynamic range. Who has the biggest dynamic range? As though dynamic range is the only thing that matters in image quality. Obviously, dynamic range is important, but your color gamut is equally important. When you have a huge, even, uniform color gamut, it allows you to make that camera look however you want very easily. So if you want your Venice 2 to look like an ARRI, you can, because that ARRI color gamut sits within the Sony color gamut. So everything the ARRI can capture is there in terms of color and beyond. So there is an absolute enormous palette of colors that you can paint these cameras with. And that gives you amazing flexibility in post-production to create your own looks and your own styles. And for this film, if anybody does remember the original film, it's very stylized. It has all sorts of wacky colors. There's lots of models. There's puppetry in it. The new film really follows on from what was done in the first film with practical effects. And that's where I was involved. We were doing some in-camera effects that we don't think anyone's ever seen before in a film. And we had a specially adapted Venice camera to do it. It was quite an easy adaptation, as it turns out. And that palette has allowed them to create this really unique look for the film. Now, Venice and the other cameras in the cinema line all basically have this very similar, very large gamut, and Burano is no exception. So Burano, in my opinion, what is it? Is it a replacement for the FX9? No, it's not. It's something quite different to the FX9. Is really a small digital cinema camera. But at the same time, it does have a lot of the features that a camera like the FX9 has. And its big thing, though, is that it's much smaller than a Venice 2. It's a lot lighter than a Venice 2. There is one that you can pick up a little bit later on. You can try it on your shoulder, and you'll see how much light compared to a Venice 2. But then to make shooting with it very easy, Sony have included their variable ND filter, so you can just dial in whatever amount of ND that you want. You can program it to work in one-stop steps if you want, so it behaves much more like a Venice 2 if you want it to work that way. It also has in-body image stabilization, IBIS. And this is an actually really great feature if you're shooting handheld with the camera. And it really gives you that sort of ability to pick the camera up, leave the tripod behind, and shoot huge parts of your production handheld if that's what you want to do. And if you're using longer lenses, it takes out all that sort of shake and wobble that maybe if you haven't had enough coffee in the morning or something like that might be causing a problem for your shots. Have Sony's really incredible autofocus. And Burano takes that to the next level. So this now has a new AI processing chip that recognizes not just faces of people, but the profile of a human being. And I'll show you how this works a little bit later on, is it can detect somebody even when they're not looking at the camera or not facing the camera. So if you're doing a walking, talking type shot, if you're trying to follow an actor in an action scene, even if they've got their back to the camera will recognize that person and follow them. And I think this has the potential to be incredibly liberating for a lot of filmmakers. Now, if you talk to the people that made the film The Creator with the FX3, one of the big reasons they used the FX3 was it gave them the ability to be very nimble, to be able to move a very small crew from country to country, from location to location very quickly and very easily, because the whole camera package was small, it was lightweight, so a lot of the movie was shot either handheld or on a gimbal or with shoulder rigs. And because you're not moving around a lot of very heavy grip equipment, it really helped with that ability to jump from location to location to location. Now, Burano wasn't available then, but I'm quite sure that if Burano had been available to them, it would have been the perfect camera for that production, because it would have given them all of those things that the FX3 has, but with a 16-bit recording from an 8K sensor. So it would have allowed them to really sort of pretty much match the Venice image quality, but still have that flexibility to shoot in a very nimble, very fluid manner. And I think this is what Burano is all about. Now, it's a full-frame sensor. It's 8.6K at its highest resolution, and it also supports Super 35, and at Super 35, it's 5.8K. So it's also, as well as a full-frame sensor, a really excellent Super 35 camera. So there's a whole world of lenses that you can tap into in that Super 35 world, because movie cameras, films been through the 35mm for something like 50 years has been the normal size. So in terms of anamorphic lenses in particular, there's far, far more choices at Super 35 than there are at full frame. And there's a lot of spherical lenses you can use as well. And because you can just jump between Super 35 or full frame, you can use whichever lens that you want depending on the type of shot and the type of thing that you're doing. And of course, we do have this color gamut that is synced with the Venice 2 camera. So if you're used to color grading a Venice 2, you'll have absolutely no problem with Burano. Now, in terms of the lens mount, it comes with the same lens mount as supplied with a Venice 2 camera, and that's a PL mount that's bolted directly to the front of the body of the camera. And you undo 6 screws, 6 bolts, they're captive in the mount so they don't fall out. And behind that is Sony's E-mount. And then you can use Sony's E-mount lenses that brings that amazing autofocus with it, if you wish. Nobody's forcing anyone to use autofocus if you don't want to. But it really is an amazing tool. So how many people here have actually used autofocus on one of Sony's more recent cameras? There's quite a lot, but there's also a lot that haven't. Now, I'm one of those people who, I do a lot of these presentations. I've been doing presentations for a long, long time on various Sony cameras, going way back to sort of optical disc and things like that. And for a long, long time, you'd have a camera with autofocus, and it wasn't actually terribly good. And I'd stand in front of a group like this and say, well, I'm a professional, I don't use autofocus. Why, as a professional, would I use autofocus? Because it's rubbish. But my view on that has absolutely, totally changed now. From Sony's A7S III onwards, the autofocus that Sony have is so good that I wouldn't want to buy a camera without it now. I shoot a lot with Venice 2, and the images that you can get from this are fantastic. But one of the things that's always nice about shooting with the Venice 2 is generally if you're shooting on a camera like this, you've got a crew, and your first AC or your focus puller is doing your focus for you. So you can actually say, well, if it's not in focus, it's not my fault. I can blame somebody else for it. But if you are a one-man band, if you're self-shooting, you don't have that luxury anymore. And if you are self-shooting, trying to look in a viewfinder, compose your shot, frame it nicely, you might be looking at what's going on with the action and everything else, and keep it in focus at the same time is really, really hard. And especially as we're going to bigger and bigger sensors, and we're tending to want to have shallower and shallower depths of field, it gets really seriously tough. And I think if you go and watch a lot of feature films now, and you're really critical about focus, there's a lot of times when they're not in focus, or the focus is just slightly off. And it's not nice, it's not good, but when you look at the depth of field, maybe how the camera's moving, how the actors and the talent are moving, you can understand why it might be slightly off, because the focus puller's job today is now incredibly difficult compared to what it was when we shot with Super 35 or we shot with traditional video cameras with even smaller sensors. Their job has just got harder and harder and harder. And I think we've reached a point now where actually the electronics can do it better. Not always, but in a lot of cases, we'll be able to focus more accurately, more precisely than you or a good AC can. That doesn't mean to say that we don't need that focus puller role anymore, because again, if you're a camera operator and you're trying to follow the action in something or frame and compose, making sure that the autofocus is actually focused where you want it to be all of the time at the same time isn't easy. So we're still going to need somebody on set to keep an eye on focus. Somebody that understands how to program the autofocus, because it's highly adjustable and different settings make it behave in different ways. Perhaps somebody using the monitor and control app or something like that to actually determine where the focus window is within the frame, to make sure that the camera is focusing where you want it to focus, all of those things. So that job doesn't go away, it just changes. And I think things like the focus assist and stuff like that can really transform even the very highest quality, high-end, big budget movies in the future. And a prediction that I have, and I might be completely wrong with this, is that going forwards we will start to see ways of taking the internal focusing system from the camera and actually taking that to drive focus motors on traditional lenses. Because I think AF autofocus or focus assist systems are immensely useful tools. So having the ability to use autofocus with an E-mount lens on the camera is really a big, big deal. Now I'm going to show a couple of videos. I was involved with the production of 2 videos very early on with the pre-production cameras. And I know we've shown you quite a few videos already. You may have caught a couple of these 2 videos already as before we started. But the 2 videos were quite different, with 2 very different approaches to try and sort of show off what Burano is capable of. So the first video that I'm going to show you in a moment, which is called Sum of One, was quite a large crew, fairly typical crew for a mid-budget, perhaps commercial type shoot, something like that. And for that, we used some prototypes of the Cooke SP3 lenses, which are manually focused cine-style lenses. They're really lovely lenses. And it was done as you would a typical commercial focus puller pulling focus, camera operator shooting, director directing, etc. And I think it looks really good. It's very dynamic film, lots of camera movement, lots of handheld work. And actually for the film, we deliberately switched off the IBIS, because for this particular film, we wanted that grittiness that you get with a handheld shoot, handheld production. The second film that I'm going to show you, which is called The Uncertainty Principle, was basically a two-man shoot and camera operator. And for that shoot, it's all G-master lenses and it's all autofocus. And I don't think you would know that it was autofocus. There's nothing in the film, in my view, that gives away the fact that it's autofocus. But what it meant was it was essentially shot in a day, very, very quickly, very small crew, much lighter camera package, much lower cost compared to cine lenses, the sort of photo lenses, the E-mount lenses from Sony, relatively low cost. And I also think it looks really good. So let's have a look at the first of those films. Now, in terms of the colorimetry, the monitors more accurately represent what these films are supposed to look like. The screen seems to be in slightly the wrong color space. So let's have a look at this one first.
Success. It's often elusive, but it's attainable. You just have to start. It starts with you. Success comes from you, not at you. Work independent. Chase it. Dream it. Taste it. Take action. Small steps forward. Try, fail. Fail, but learn. Get up and do it again. Get up and do it again. Get up and do it again. Until you join others with skills of their own.
Scene 3, take 1.
Sony.
Okay, so that was shot in Cape Town, I think it was August last year, so it was very early on. Really were sort of learning the camera almost as we went along, but it was a very, very fast learning process because the camera is, I think, very intuitive to use. Now for this shoot, because it was a crude shoot, we had the camera configured very much to replicate the way you might operate a Venice 2. So we had the LCD screen mounted on the assistant side of the camera, and we used what Sony called a home screen function. So you press the home button on the LCD, and this menu comes up called the home screen menu, or sometimes referred to as the Big Six, because you have the 6 key features of the camera, the frame rate, exposure index, shutter speed, ND filter, your monitoring look, and white balance displayed. And just by changing, it's a touch screen, so you can just touch on those functions or press the 6 buttons. You can very quickly change those things. Now, there is actually something that changes about the camera's configuration when that home screen is turned on. And this is by design. So when the home screen is turned on like this, what is output on the SDI or the HDMI in terms of overlays is greatly reduced. And that's deliberate. So when you turn this on, basically on your SDI or HDMI output, all you're going to have is frame lines. You can have a few other things like the battery capacity, you can have time code and a few other items, but your screen isn't cluttered with a huge amount of junk about maybe what focal length of the lens is and things like that that is normally on those overlays. So it gives you very much a cleaner feed that you can send to your video village or to your director's monitor, to the AC's monitor, and things like that. And the other thing that happens when this home screen is on, if you bring up the camera's menus, they don't appear on the SDI or HDMI outputs. So the idea is that the AC or the camera operator can bring up the home screen, bring up the menus, and do all of those things, and that stuff doesn't get sent to the video village. As soon as you turn the home screen off, just press the home button, all that stuff gets sent to the video village again. All of the menus, menu pages, all of the overlay information. So the camera has 2, in effect, distinctly different operating modes, depending on whether you're using this home screen or not. It's very easy to go between them because it's just a case of pressing the home button to turn the home screen on or off. So that's how we shot. We also had the camera on a gimbal, yeah.
So does it mean that when you're shooting on and you're using the touch screen for the focus, so the director always will see the whole thing?
Yes. So, well, not necessarily, because you can turn the overlays on and off. So there's 2 different configurations. Can we bring the camera up? May as well, the easiest thing will be to show you how it changes. At the moment, I don't have the home screen on. On my viewfinder LCD here, I have pretty much an image that looks like this, with the exception that on the LCD screen currently right now, the image is shrunk, and all of this stuff about FF6K, etc., is around the outside of the image. Okay, so that's what I'm seeing in the viewfinder right now. When I press the home screen button, most of that stuff disappears. The stuff that remains, like the time code, the audio levels, I could individually turn on and off. And I can also, if I want to, I could bring up my frame lines as well. If I go into the menu now, if I press the menu button on the camera, the menu comes up on the LCD on the camera, but not on the SDI output. If I just come back out of the menus, if I turn the home screen off and I bring the menus up, then they'll come up on the output. Now, in terms of what is on the output, though, so let's just say for a minute I'm going to use my touch focus. I don't have a Sony lens on here at the moment, so I can't use touch focus right now. But if I had a Sony lens on the camera, I could touch the screen to focus. But at the same time, I could just turn the displays off, and I can still use touch to focus. And if we go into this page of this menu, of the quick menu here, I have the option to turn the info displays for the SDI on and off, but I can still have the info display, let's bring that back on, for the LCD. So there's lots and lots of different ways you can configure what is coming out of the SDI or what is on the LCD screen, depending on the way you want to shoot. I have a display button, and that will turn everything globally on and off, but then I also have the ability in the menu to turn the overlays on and off for the SDI or for the HDMI. So I have different things. Yeah?
Are the SDIs linked?
The SDIs are linked, they are not separate. The SDI and HDMI are separate, so you can have, depending on the mode that this camera is in, and there are, one of the things with this camera, there are a lot of variations in what you can output on the HDMI or SDI, or whether you can have both or not, depending on the codec that you're using. There are some differences there. But you can turn SDI and HDMI, they're generally independent. But the two SDIs are always the same. They follow each other. And the two SDIs, the top one is a 12G SDI. Again, it depends on the codec and the mode that you're in. In some cases, you'll be able to have 4K on that and then HD on SDI 2, which is a 3G SDI. But these vary depending on exactly how the camera is configured. Okay? Right. So the main point really at this stage was just to show what that home screen, whether you have that home screen on or off, does affect what goes on and off on the HDMI and SDI. So I've got the home screen on now, so I could actually, if I go into the menus, I'm just going to go into the menus here, and I go into my monitoring and turn on my frame lines in my markers. So I could put an aspect ratio marker in on my frame lines. Now when I turn the home menu on, that remains. If I don't want the time code, I could turn that on and off. And now the AC could come in and he could go into the menu, change some settings in the menu, so I could actually go into the menu right now. And if I don't want the time code being displayed, I can go down here and turn the time code off. But I'm able to make those changes without that having an effect on what's being sent to the video village. Turn the home screen off again, and all of that other stuff comes back up on the display. Okay, so if we can come back to the laptop, please.
One question?
Yes?
If you go for the widescreen shot, does it shoot 60 by 9, or does the center crop to 40 to 9?
So shooting anamorphic. So the sensor currently can only operate in 16 by 9 and 17 by 9 aspect ratios. The sensor, though, is tall enough that if you're using a Super 35 anamorphic lens, it's actually the correct height for that type of lens. And then the camera does have, if we can come back to the camera, it does have desqueeze. So if I go into the menu, what was flashing? It's just that. If I go into the menu and I go to desqueeze, I can go to a 2 times desqueeze, and what you'll see, so with the desqueeze off, if you look at how wide the frame is, because there's 16 by 9 frame at the moment, or no, 17 by 9. When I go to the 2 times desqueeze, it also crops the sides, because that's what you're going to have to do to your shot in post-production to get a 2:40 aspect ratio. So it's not only just desqueezing, because if you just desqueezed and did nothing else, you'd have a vignette on the sides, because the sensor is in effect too wide. It also crops the sides off by the correct amount to give you your final 240 or 239 aspect ratio.
Is it also cropping the recording? Or?
No, the recording is not cropped. This is purely a monitoring desqueeze. So you'll have to do that crop in post. And I know that really sounds very negative. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to have to crop. I'm throwing away a whole load of picture information. Why should I have to do that? But you are starting at 8.6K. So yes, you're going to crop 30% off the sides of your image to get the right aspect ratio, but your image is still over 6K across. So it's still higher resolution than an awful lot of the other cameras that shoot Super 35 anamorphic that are on the market today. It's considerably higher resolution. So it's really not a big deal just to throw that data away, in effect. You're going to have a really super high quality anamorphic image from this camera. It's just a different way of doing it to what we're used to. Yeah?
Since we're on the subject of anamorphics already,
Yes.
IBIS also.
So if you turn on desqueeze, IBIS doesn't work. IBIS is turned off because what would happen is you would have too much stabilization in the horizontal axis compared to the vertical. So you would actually get some really weird artifacts in the image because it would be stabilized effectively only in the one direction and not the other.
Some brands have image stabilization that's specific to anamorphic lenses, but this is not true for the
I don't think anybody has.
Oh, Sony has some on small cameras, system cameras like the.
That works with PL lenses.
No.
Yeah.
So for PL lenses, this is the only camera that can do that IBIS stabilization. I mean, so it's a pretty unique feature. But with anamorphic, certainly at the moment, it's a problem because each different anamorphic aspect ratio would require a very different amount of stabilization. Now, it's quite possible, and I don't know, I have no knowledge on this, but that sounds to me like one of the things that could be done in firmware, because you're just saying, well, only move it half as much in that axis compared to the other. So that's the kind of things that you might see as a firmware update later on. I'm absolutely not saying it's coming. Let's get that right out there. I'm not saying it's something that's coming, but it is the kind of thing that potentially I could see happening. Certainly in the firmware roadmap, there's a 4x3 scan mode in the firmware roadmap for the camera. I have no details of what that 4x3 scan mode will be. What I would say, and this is my opinion, this is not the Sony party line or anything like that, is 4x3 is scan mode normally associated with 2x super 35 anamorphic lenses. If you're shooting Burano Venice full frame anamorphic, you'll normally be 6x5 or 4x3. 3x4. So that's not a full frame aspect ratio. So my suspicion would be that that's going to be essentially super 35 anamorphic as opposed to full frame anamorphic. And there are, I'll come one second. There are some issues with data rates as well. So the cards that Burano uses, the CF Express cards, I've got one in the camera. This is with Sony's cards, and the cards that are recommended for the camera are rated for 400 megabytes per second. They're VPG 400 cards. If you use a VPG 400 card, it's absolutely guaranteed to work no matter what, whether the card is full or whether the card is 5 years old and some of the wear leveling and things like that is happening. It's guaranteed to work regardless. Now, there are some cards on the market that claim to be faster, claim to be able to write at sustained speeds for faster, but they don't guarantee it. They make a claim, but they don't guarantee it categorically. VPG 400 is that guarantee. If you're shooting 8.6K XOCN LT at 30 frames per second, you're actually getting quite close to that speed limit. So if you were then to try and shoot open gate, it's a lot more data, you're probably going to be exceeding the limits of what these cards could do. It's going to be certainly right on that limit. So I've got a question from over here first, and I've noted the guy with the red jumper over there. I'll come back to you in a second.
Since we're talking about the roadmap, I was wondering if Sony's also looking for an autofocus system that works like with the Ronin 4D, or the DJI 4D. We have this Lidar system which focuses non-autofocus lenses.
Yeah, I can't speak for I've certainly not seen anything like that mentioned. And I can't speak directly for Sony. What I would suggest for that is, so one is the way the Sony system works, where you're actually using the actual image and measuring using the phase detection photosites, whether that image is in focus or not, is much, much better than any LiDAR system. If you've used the LiDAR system, you'll know that it can't tell the difference between somebody's eyes and the end of their nose. It sees a face, and it'll focus on that face. And very often you'll have the nose in focus, but not the eyes, or the ears in focus. because it's basically just trying to measure distance rather than, and the reflection back from the face is the face as opposed to just the eyes. It's not that accurate. So Sony's system, where it's actually looking at the image itself and measuring 600 odd points across that image, is it actually in focus or not, is able to differentiate between the eye and the nose and the lips and everything else on the face. So it's a lot more accurate. As far as I'm aware, there's no ability or a way to take that information about the focus then to drive an external motor at this time. Doesn't mean to say it won't come in the future. I believe it will. I think that's something that will come. Will it be Burano that does that? My view is probably not. I would love Sony to surprise me and to do it. I would love that. But there are issues driving external motors in how fast you can turn them. Because one of the things with the way the autofocus in these cameras works is because the focus can be turned incredibly quickly, that the moment that lens turns, the camera knows whether the image is getting sharper or not, and will either stop, go the other way perhaps, or whatever. It's instant. That feedback between the lens moving and the focus system in the camera is pretty much instant. You try turning a cinema lens, it's not going to be anywhere near that fast. They're heavy, they have a lot more inertia and things like that. So the whole internal focus mechanism now that we have in a modern autofocus lens is the focusing element is generally focused with a linear motor. It floats. So if you pick up a lot of these lenses, that's the focus element moving backwards and forwards because it's that free. And it has to be that free that it can move fast enough for really good autofocus to work. You don't have that in a cinema lens. And it's generally a lens somewhere in the middle of the camera body that's moved using a linear motor. Gentleman here with the red.
It's a reason why the Burano is limited to XOCN LT and not maybe for like the Super 35 model, which is a higher bit rate.
At the moment, it's limited to LT. At 8K, you couldn't have ST. It's too much for the cards. In the 6K mode, 60p would exceed the cards. Super 35 at 60p would exceed what the cards can do. Potentially, I guess, yes, for maybe 24 frames per second or 30 frames per second in the 6K or perhaps in the Super 35, it's theoretically possible. So I wouldn't rule it out. It's something that could come. I don't know. Again, I would love it to come. It would be nice. But a lot of people, though, they focus in on this, oh my God, it's only LT. If you put LT and XT side by side in the timeline, you can't tell which is which. You honestly can't 99% of the time. So the XOCN codec is a wavelet codec. So the codecs that you're probably familiar with in cameras like FX3, FX6, they use a type of compression called DCT, discrete cosine transformation. Horrible, horrible technical word. But we're all very familiar with, let's say, an H.264 file, like some of these clips that I've been playing these demo reels with. And when there is too much compression, or the compression rate is lowered, you see artifacts. You see these like double edges and ghosting and macro blocks. You get these blocking effects. And that is very much a characteristic of DCT codecs because of the way they work. The compression technique, or one of the techniques that's used in XOCN, is called wavelet. And it divides the image into frequencies and does all sorts of magic science. And what it means is that the compression artifact, if the bit rate is too low or you compress it too high, the artifact that you get is the image becomes softer. That's it. Because that's the artifact, if you increase the compression ratio, the worst thing that you will see within the image is in certain very highly detailed areas, it will be a tiny bit softer than it should be. your audience will never see that. They will never, ever notice, oh, hang on a minute, that leaf on that tree over there, it's a little bit soft. They're not going to see that. And if you put XOCN XT and LT of a very highly detailed scene side by side, you've really, really got to blow it up onto the biggest screen you can find to see that happening. You can see it and you can find it, but you've got to work hard, really hard, to actually see that softening of the image. And it's just a softening of the image. So it's not a nasty artifact in any way. And there are a lot of larger productions that I know that have chosen LT over XT because, well, actually, by the time especially if you're delivering in 4K, you'll never ever see the difference in the image anyway. And in terms of your storage and working on set, archiving, all of that is so much faster. So why not use LT anyway, because it doesn't look any different. So yes, ST, if it comes, wonderful. Thank you very much, Sony. But I'm really not worried that it's not there. I mean, I've shot with Venice, and I do a lot of stuff with Venice where we've been traveling on the road and in remote locations where backups and archiving is an issue. So we've shot on LT. And I've never got back and thought, oh my God, I wish we'd shot on XT. Because it's just not like that. It's not like a DCT codec, where if you have too much compression, the artifacts are annoying and you can see them and they're not nice. With the XOCN codec, you won't ever actually see the artifact unless you've got the comparable uncompressed image to compare it with. And even then, you've really got to look hard, really, really hard to find it. So I don't see not having ST or XT at all something that people should be stressing or worried about. And I kind of think because of where Burano will be used, maybe by people doing documentaries, high-end documentaries, perhaps for people doing wildlife and things like that, that they're going to want that smaller file size most of the time anyway. And I'll come on to file sizes a little bit later on, but it's very efficient. Back to you, yes?
Yes, but I was wondering, it's good information that you say that the image softens up. I've never noticed that.
No.
But didn't do a hell of a lot of research either. But I was wondering, does it throw away color information as well, or really zero?
Oh, it's compressed. It's not absolutely not giving up any information. But what it's throwing away, for want of a better word, is you'll lose some chroma resolution. So where that softening is occurring, it's not RGB, it's not 4:4, it's not any of those, it's raw, it's red, green, and blue pixels. You just have slightly lower resolution in the chroma in those areas. So this comes back to, I mean, what are you doing? I mean, if you're doing something that is very, very special effects heavy, you would probably want a Venice 2 shooting XT because that's the best you can get. But even then, you know, I've done chroma key, I've experimented with chroma key and stuff like with Burano, and it keys really, really well. So this compression softening, you'll really struggle to find it in any aspect, whether it's color, whether it's your gamut doesn't get any smaller. It makes no difference to that. So it's just actually some loss of very, very fine textures in some parts of the image. And it's not the whole image doesn't go soft, it's only that artifact only will ever crop up in the very, very highly detailed, finest texture areas. Any more questions? Yes? Yes. I will show the other clip, yes. Yes, I'm just about to get back to that because absolutely. But it's not a problem. Nothing. We won't miss anything out. It may be that because we've talked a lot about different things right now, because I'm going to talk about the codec, and I've got a codec slide later on, that we skip over that slide in a bit. So yeah, if we come back to the slides. So does it really look like a Venice 2? I think the simple answer is absolutely yes, it does. We've put these cameras, Venice 2 and Burano, side by side in tests, and there are some subtle differences in the white balance perhaps. If you can white balance off a card with both cameras, basically, if you do that, you can't tell which is which a lot of the time. They do look the same. But it's not the same sensor. Sony have been very clear about this from day one, that it's not the same sensor in Burano as in Venice 2. The sensor that's in Venice 2 is a very advanced stacked multi-layer sensor, has an exceptionally fast readout speed because of that technology. The sensor that's in Burano has the same color space, has the same color science. I believe it has the same color filters. But a key difference, of course, is Venice 2 doesn't have autofocus, so there's no phase detection sites on this chip, whereas this camera, Burano, has autofocus, so it has to have phase detection sites to do the autofocus. So they are two different sensors, and there are, the readout speeds are not the same. This is exceptionally fast. This is pretty good for a standard, for an 8K camera. But in terms of how way the pictures look, in terms of sensitivity, in terms of noise, in terms of all of those things, they're very well matched. Now, one of the things that I have been looking at very closely recently is the sensors in most of the smaller cameras, like an FX3, FX6, and most of the other smaller cameras that are on the market today. There's a part within that chip called the analog to digital converter. And that determines your very subtle tonal textures in the image. And on most of the cameras that operate as a video camera, that A to D converter runs at 12-bit. So your FX3, FX6, etc., they're all 12-bit. Venice here, Venice 2, I'm led to believe is a 14-bit A to D, and then you have a 16-bit codec, and you do need a 16-bit codec if you've got a 14-bit A to D, because when you do the compression, when you do all of the mathematics to get from 14-bit to the codec, there will be new values created that are beyond 14-bit. So if you do want to preserve everything the sensor outputs when you compress that signal, you need more bits in the codec than you have at the sensor. So that's why we have a 16-bit output, 14-bit, I'm led to believe, A to D. Looking at the images from Burano and from Venice 2 and looking at the textural information, either Burano has an exceptionally good 12-bit A to D, or it too is running at 14-bit. And that's actually important because and you can see it in the Burano image. It has a lot more textural information. When you record with XOCN, you need that 16-bit codec to see that. It's there in Burano, and it's one of the things that makes the image look really, really good. It's all this extra textural information. I can't categorically say it's 14-bit, but from what I've seen of the images, I think it probably is. And then, again, having that 16-bit codec makes a big difference. Right, so let's go to the other film. The sum of one, the uncertainty principle. And there's a couple of reasons why I want to show this film. One of them is to have a look at the skin tones. So one of the things that I was very skeptical of actually when Sony launched Venice 2 was they put an 8K sensor in Venice 2. The previous camera was a 6K sensor, or the Venice 1 sensor is 6K. And I was kind of a little bit skeptical because, to be honest, I have delivered in 8K now, but it's the exception. 99.9% of everything that I deliver is in 4K. So I was on that camp of, well, why the hell do I need an 8K sensor? What difference is it going to make? Yeah, the Venice 1 sensor is a really nice sensor. Why do I need an 8K sensor? Then I started shooting with Venice 2 at 8K, and I'm like, oh my goodness. Look at all of this extra color information that's in the image. Because we have to remember that all of these cameras now, all of these large sensor cameras use these Bayer sensors. And you have this arrangement of pixels, red, green, and blue. So not every point in the image has a full red, green, and blue sample. And we have to do a lot of clever mathematics and things like that to work out what is going on that's red where there's a green pixel, or in where there's a where there's a blue pixel. What is the red that's there? And generally that's done by taking the adjacent pixels and creating some sort of average value to estimate what goes in there, or if there's an edge, there's other processes that happen. So the chroma resolution, the color resolution that we have from a 4K sensor, where across that sensor there are 2K of green pixels on each row, but only 2K of blue pixels on every other row, the color information isn't anywhere near 4K. It's probably actually closer to 2K. And if you try and raise that resolution too high, if you try and make that 4K sensor too sharp, you run into an issue called aliasing and moire. And if you have ever used an FX6 or an FX3 perhaps, you may have come across certain situations with fabric or very, very finely woven fabrics and textures where you'll see some rainbow colors over its moire. And it's one of those trade-offs that you have with CMOS sensors, is that to get good resolution, you need to have a fairly weak low-pass filter, and as a result, in certain circumstances, you can get moire. You could get rid of the moire altogether by having a lower cutoff on the optical low-pass filter, but to have zero moire, you'd have to have 2K resolution, because that's your Nyquist limit because of the way the pixels are. And of course that wouldn't be acceptable. You've got a camera with a 4K sensor, but it only produces an HD image because of aliasing issues and moire. So we're always playing a bit of a trade-off, especially when it's a 4K camera delivering for 4K. The reality is that a 4K camera, a camera with a 4K sensor, can't actually deliver an image that is 4K. It's going to be somewhat less than that. It's probably typically around 3K of luma resolution and about HD color resolution. That's still the reality of Bayer sensors. But when you go to an 8K sensor, you do actually have 4K of color information, 4K of luma information. So those of you that want a 444 workflow, you need an 8K sensor to have a true 444 RGB workflow at 4K. And you can see it in that 4K deliverable. You can see the extra color information, especially on faces and places where there are very, very subtle variations in tones. Because if you imagine a face, you have all the pores and the texture on a face. Those are very, very subtle differences from one part of a face to another, one bit of skin to the next. And by having much higher color sampling, also a 16-bit codec with XOCN gives you much more textural information. Suddenly faces and skin tones can look that bit better, that much nicer in fact, at 4K, even with a 4K deliverable. Yeah.
Would it then not be better to have two different OLPFs as you had with the F55 and F5 for different resolutions? So I remember you had for Super 16 you had a different OLPF. Would that not benefit the Burano if you had one for full frame and one for Super 35?
So with the 55 you had two OLPFs, not for Super 16, but so you could run the sensor at 2K. Yeah. So you could run the sensor itself at a lower resolution. So that wouldn't benefit Burano because you'd have to run the Burano sensor at 4K to get a 4K output, a 4K raw output. But because of the OLPF, it's not actually going to be 4K resolution. So you're back to you may as well just shoot with an FX6 and be done with it. It would defeat the object of the camera, basically, to do that. Arguably, you could have an FX6, you could put a 2K OLPF in an FX6 and it would produce amazing HD. Yeah. Do we actually want an amazing HD camera these days? You may as well just shoot at 4K and then downsample it. Same thing. So, you know, with the F5 and 55, the issue was that to go to higher frame rates than 60 frames per second, you had to go down to a 2K read, especially on the F5, on the sensor. So you were skipping pixels. And to then not have aliasing and moire, you had to change the optical low-pass filter. So this is a slightly different scenario. Right, so let's get to this next film. So one of the things that I always like to really look at with this film is the skin tones and the textures. There's lots of big close-ups of the faces of the actors in here. And of course, remember that this film is all shot with autofocus using Sony's E-mount lenses. So let's just...
If we could observe the electron, at any one instant, the electron would be found at some particular location.
Yeah, there was no influence from Oppenheimer in that at all. But that was shot in about a day and a half in South Africa. It was basically shot in a junkyard. And it's a great place because they've got all this electronic rubbish lying around and you can just pick up stuff and make stuff that looks really fancy and complicated and even make a time machine. So yeah, but it's all essentially, well, it is all autofocus with Sony's lenses. And you have this ability with the autofocus to program it. So you can just say just faces or not faces or just humans or not humans. And you can then isolate different parts of the frame and say, well, the autofocus is only to work in this part of the frame, but not the other part. So it's immensely programmable. And then you combine that with the IBIS for that handheld shooting, very fluid, very flexible shooting. And it makes actually shooting something like this very, very easy compared to a lot of other cameras, because you don't really need a gimbal and things like that for most of the shots. And the skin tones just look really nice because you have that chroma, that color resolution in the big close-ups. You have a lot more texture to the skin that you wouldn't perhaps see in a 4K camera. And that, especially on a big screen like this, makes a difference. And also the noise. I don't know how many of you noticed the sort of texture that the noise has. The clip that I played you is a H.264 file, so it's very, very highly compressed. But the noise that the camera produces when you're shooting in the 8K or even in the 6K scan modes is very, very fine. And it's actually quite pleasing in my opinion. I really do like the noise that the camera makes. And it's always a shame to actually reduce it any more than it already, from the level that it already is in the camera, because it looks very nice. And even when you shoot at 3200 ISO, so it's a dual base ISO camera, shoots at 800 and 3200 ISO, that noise is very pleasing. It's very nice. It's almost something you want in the image rather than trying to take it away, because it's so very fine, it looks a lot more film-like than most electronic cameras do. So it's something I like a lot. So in terms of all the different scan modes that the camera has, there's a lot of them. So the largest one that we have is full frame 8.6K in 16:9 or 17:9. One of the interesting things is that unlike most cameras, the 16:9 frame is taller than the 17:9 capture frame. So most cameras, you go from 17:9, they tend to crop the sides a little bit. So you lose a little bit of your field of view. With this camera, it actually raises the image. The image gets taller when you go to 16:9, so your field of view doesn't really change when you switch between 16:9 and 17:9, which is actually a really nice thing to not have that field of view change. The same with the full frame crop mode. So this full frame crop mode, I don't quite know why how Sony come about some of their naming conventions sometimes, because you would think, oh, full frame crop 6K has got to be much smaller than full frame 8.6K. Well, it isn't. It's only about a 7% crop. It's a tiny crop of the image, very small crop, and that gives you a 6K raw output. So I'm not exactly sure how Sony are doing it, but they tell me that all the pixels are red, and it's downsampled to give you that 6K output. And it's kind of almost one of the sweet spots for the camera, because it allows you to shoot at higher frame rates. So at 8.6K, you are limited to 30 frames per second, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One of the ones is that going above 30 frames per second at 8.6K, it won't fit. It's too much for a CF Express Type B card. The data rate would be too high. So you've got to drop down in resolution to 6K. That halves your data rate, allows you to have twice as high a frame rate using the same media. We also have then the Super 35 mode, 5.8K, 16:9, 17:9, and the camera looks absolutely fantastic in this mode as well. So it's not really a compromise shooting at Super 35. You can absolutely do it. If you do want to go faster than 60 frames per second, though, you do need to drop down to this Super 35 crop, which is a fair crop, to be honest, from Super 35, but that allows you to shoot at 120 frames per second, same dynamic range, same color science, same everything else. So there's not really a large difference in image quality or anything like that. And the 4K 120 frames per second from this camera looks fantastic. You just will want to use some quite wide lenses.
Does it have faster rolling or faster readout times on Super 35?
Yeah, absolutely. So like any camera, the fewer pixels that you read out, the lower your rolling shutter gets. So in the 4K mode, it's the same as any other 4K camera. It's absolutely no worse. The rolling shutter at 4K is the same pretty much as FX6 and all of those other cameras that are out there now. You read out more pixels, it takes longer. So the rolling shutter does get worse as you read out more and more pixels. That's an inevitability of CMOS sensors really these days, if you want to maintain the same quality. Generally, there might be ways to read it out faster, but often that would result in maybe running the A to D, the analog to digital converter at a lower bit depth and things like that. So that's something the FX6 does. So the FX6, when you go from 4K full frame, the normal 4K to 120 frames per second, the A to D drops. And you can see that in the images if you look carefully enough. You can see that you'll be more prone to getting banding across the sky. You might have more the image is coarser. You lose some of your subtle skin tones and things like that at 120 frames per second on an FX6. And I believe, from my own research, that's because the A to D on the chip has to go down to 10-bit to be able to do that. That's how they're able to do it in that particular camera. In this camera, rather than sacrificing some other element of image quality, then you use a crop mode to get to 120 frames per second. So that's what goes on. So if we can switch over to the camera, we'll go through those modes. Where's Andre gone? Is he? He's snuck off. Here he comes. Yes. There is an S&Q button. No, it will stay at the full frame, and you'll be able to choose from 0 to 30 frames per second.
So it's not possible to go from 8K 25 to Super 35?
Not by one press of a button. No, it's not. You can assign the crop mode to an assignable button on the camera, and you can toggle to all of the different crop modes, and from there go into S&Q. But you can't go directly from full frame uncropped into the cropped modes. So when you assign the crop mode to the assignable button, it toggles between all the crop modes. It never comes out of the crop modes, so it never goes back to the 8.6K. So to go back to the 8.6K, you have to actually go into the menu. Yeah, so that's at the moment. That, again, might be something that could be changed in firmware in the future. Possibly, I don't know. So we have Andre in the wrong aspect ratio. Yeah, you put on weight, Andre. Yeah, let's slim you up a little bit. There you go. Thank you. So in terms of the different frame sizes and the frame modes in the camera. So this is the 8.6K, and I think this let me just change the battery on the camera because this is about to go flat. Typical timing. I've got one ready to go. So anyone that was here early, some of you guys, what's the time now? We're getting close to 3 o'clock. This battery has been running this camera since about 12 o'clock, something like that. So that camera's been on the battery for probably getting towards 2.5 hours, something like that. So this camera, compared to a Venice, uses very little power. That's a 143. There you go. Now the power consumption of the camera does depend on the codec that you're using. So it does actually use more power when you're using the XOCN codec. It can get to as much as 50 watts if you've got everything in the camera, all the Wi-Fi and networking stuff turned on and things like that. But it's typically about 45 watts when you're running XOCN with the LCD screen. If you're using the XAVC codec, that drops down to about 35 watts. It's about the same as an FX9 if you're using the XAVC codec. So it does give you some idea of the amount of processing power that the RAW requires to get that into the camera. And that may be one of the reasons why we don't have XOCN in any of the small cameras, because that would be a lot of heat to try and dissipate and to get rid of. So the camera, in terms of power, is pretty good. So this is 8.6K, and at this mode, the only thing you can record from this is XOCN, the XOCN LT codec. It's the biggest frame. So I'm going to go down now to the crop mode. In fact, I'll do it from the quick menu, and we can just drop down now to, let's go down to 17:9 in full frame crop. Okay. And did anybody notice the difference? It's a very small crop. It really is. And in fact, interestingly, this is roughly the same size as the full frame scan on an FX9. The FX9, so it all depends on what you determine to be full frame. There's no formal standard for what full frame is. So this is the full frame crop mode, and in this mode we can shoot it up to 60 frames per second and XOCN, or we can also change the codec at this stage if we want to. If we wanted to record in 4K XAVC, we could. From the 8.6K mode, there is also an XAVC codec that does work up there, actually, which is the XAVC H. And that allows you to record 8K compressed. It's an H.265 codec. From here in the 6K mode, we can shoot in 4K if we want, record in 4K using the XAVC codec, or we can shoot in 6K with the XOCN codec. So this is our 6K scan mode. And if we keep going down in our scan modes, we can go to the Super 35 5.8K. And let's just set that one. So we're now in Super 35 5.8K. Again, from here we can shoot XOCN, we can shoot XAVC HD. So we have the ability to shoot in 4K or 5.8K. And really the image quality doesn't really change. Yep.
What size is the card that's in there now?
It's a 1 gig card, I think. It's 960 gigabytes, yeah. Yeah, I mean, most of the stuff that I've shot with the camera, I've shot with either one terabyte or 500 gigabyte cards, depending on what I'm doing. On a 500 gig card at 8K, you're generally getting about 20 minutes, something like that on the card. Yeah, so now if we go, keep going down. So again, we can shoot up to 60 frames per second. And then we have the 4K crop.
So is there some pixel binning when you go from full frame to Super 35?
No. No, there's no, the camera doesn't do any pixel binning. These are all, the 8.6K, the Super 35, and then this 4K crop, they're all one-to-one direct pixel readouts. So the 6K, it's not clear and it's unknown exactly what is going on. What Sony have said, we are reading every pixel, we're not skipping any pixels, but somehow we get to a 6K output. I don't know what they're doing. There must be some form of binning going on, as opposed to skipping. You can't get from 8K to 6K. If you skip pixels, there would be horrendous aliasing and moire and all sorts of other image issues, but there aren't. So they're not skipping pixels, so they must be binning pixels to do that. And then this is our smallest crop. This is our Super 35. This is a 50mm lens on the camera. And in this one here, I can shoot at up to 120 frames per second in XOCN. And I can also do, XAVC I. There is a limitation with the XAVC I at this point, is that you can, this is only 17:9 for the if you want to shoot XAVC I. I have no idea why that limit exists. But this mode is 17:9 only. There isn't a 16:9. Strange. Yes.
Yes. You touched on the noise, so that it's much more refined. But as you zoom in, of course, then you see more noise. But how is it regarding to the previous generation of cameras, where you had the FS5 and the FS7, where you had, like in the S-Log, you had more, like in the dark parts, you had more, so you had to overexpose, of course.
Oh yeah, the noise level of this camera is very, very low. So there really isn't any need to overexpose or to shoot brighter. I mean, we're in the what is probably the worst case scenario right now, which is in this 4K scan. So your noise is the largest it will be because you're not oversampling in any way. And I'm at 800 EI, 800 base right now. And even on this big screen, yeah, there's some noise there, but this is a very big screen. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know, there might be some noise reduction going on in the TV, perhaps. But to be honest, that level of grain that's there and the way that grain looks right now to me is actually quite pleasing. Yeah. If you took that away, you'd have a very sterile image. That would be very, very easy to noise reduce in post if you did want to get rid of it. And if you did want to, I mean, if you are somebody that really hates noise completely, and believes that noise shouldn't exist in any image, and sometimes I don't quite get this. Actually, what am I doing? Just do something. If I change the EI to 400 and I open up a stop, or in fact just take some ND out, yeah, basically that noise is going to go away.
Yeah. Well, in my opinion, the noise is ugly when it's only in the dark parts and not in the lighter parts, because then you have like this filmic light.
Yeah, sometimes a part of the issue with that, not always, but sometimes, is actually the codecs that you're using.
Right.
So when you use a traditional codec like XAVC or H.264, H.265, all of those codecs, a part of the encoding process is noise reduction. They have to do a certain amount of noise reduction, otherwise the codec won't be as efficient as it is. And when that noise reduction takes place, it tends to have a smoothing effect, mostly on the mid-range of the image, but not the shadows. So you do end up with this situation where the noise isn't uniform through the image. It tends to be more noticeable, at least, in the shadow areas. And I think that's one of the issues with those very highly compressed codecs. When you shoot with XOCN, that's not a problem. There is no noise reduction. Well, there is. I mean, it's a compressed codec, so there will be processes that will eliminate some of the noise. But because it's a 16-bit codec and because of the way it works, it's not the same. And it's one of the things I just really like about shooting with this camera, with Venice. And it used to be when I had the F5 and 55, we're shooting with that 16-bit raw codec, which is now what's known as XOCN, was that extra textural information throughout the image that you get. And this is, of course, as a linear codec. So when we shoot with a log codec, when you have a log curve, each stop you go up, you are using the same amount of data, of code values in your recording. But in the real world, the actual light doubles each time you go up a stop. It's twice as much light. So when you use a log recording, in effect, you're halving your data each stop brighter that you go. And of course, then when you display your image again, it's being converted from that log through Rec 709, through whatever, back to linear light again. So in a log workflow, one of the things that tends to happen is you have less and less textural information as you go up in brightness. And that has an impact on noise, especially in the sky and things like that. Whereas if you have a linear codec like XOCN, each stop you go up, you have twice as much data. So everything is captured the way it is in the real world, the way it is coming off the sensor. And I think that really adds something to the textural feel of the footage at the end when you output that footage, is it does tend to hold on to something that just, and it's very difficult to actually quantify, but when you start working with a linear codec like XOCN, what you find is it's very, very easy to get to where you want to be with that footage compared to log. Much, much easier. And that's one of the really nice things about working with these cameras, is that codec is just a dream for post-production and to work with in post. And I think all of these things come together in a camera like this. So you do have a higher resolution sensor, so generally, most of the time, your noise is going to be much finer. You have the latest generation of sensors, so generally it's less noisy. You have a much bigger color gamut and color palette, and it's much more uniform color palette because it's a more modern, more recent sensor. And then you put that into a linear codec, and then you'd use very minimal compression, because RAW is incredibly efficient anyway. It's 3 times more efficient than conventional codecs. So you have all of these benefits coming together in the one place, and that gives you this wonderful image that's very malleable, very, very fluid, that you can really work with in post. I'm just going to go back up to the 8K scan. And before we break, what I am going to do is record a little bit of this so we can play with it afterwards. And let me go back to 800 EI, so we're not more ND. and we'll grab a little bit of that. So, have you got 8 fingers? You have got 8 fingers, yeah. So 8K, 8 fingers. There we go. You're loving this, aren't you, Renee? And then we'll just do the same with a little bit of the 6K. Oh, he's a fast learner, this guy, isn't he? There we go, a little bit of 6K. And I will move the camera so it's not a completely static and stationary shot, so we do know that I did actually record something. And then we'll do the same at, let's do the, can you do 5.8K? Yeah, he says I give up now. I just give up. 5. Yeah, that works. Yeah, that works. 5.8K. And we may as well get the full set. And we'll do the 4K. And there's the 4K. Now then, just to complete our set, and then we will break, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back up to the 8.6K. I tell you what, no, I'm going to go to, yeah, I'm going to do 8.6K. And I'm going to change the codec to XAVC H. So this is going to be the much more compressed recording. I just need to swap that to there. No, okay. Okay, well, I'll just grab a little bit of this as well. Right, so that's the compressed 8.6K, yes. Okay, so I've just captured a bit of XOCN in the different, and a bit of the XAVC codec as well. So we'll take a break, about 15 minutes or so, something like that. So I've got about 3:05, so about 3:20 we'll reconvene. And then we'll look at that footage in DaVinci Resolve in post-production, and we'll look at the difference between recording compressed with the very highly compressed codec and recording the XOCN, and also how flexible that XOCN footage is in post-production. So we'll take a break. Right, so actually though, could we come back to the camera, please? Right, lovely. So I got asked a few questions about various things during the break. So one is about the output of the camera, the look. So previously I had a look set up on the camera, which is Sony's vintage look. So one of the things we have now is a range of new looks with the camera. So this is Sony's Rec S709 LUT. We have a 709-800, which is a more contrasty one. This is a legacy LUT. But we also now have 4 new LUTs built into the camera. We have this one here, which is called Warm, which is a slightly warm look. We have Cool, which, oh, it's a bit cooler. Funny that. So we have a cool one. We have Vintage, which is the one that I had before, which is kind of subdued colors, slightly sort of film style look. And then we also have a teal and orange look that is really quite pronounced. We do have a bit of a color space mismatch going on between the camera and the screen. The camera, the screen, because it's designed for virtual production, runs 2020 and P3 color space. So, and I don't have a direct, easy way to output that from the camera and the laptop and everything else, which is why we've got a little bit of a color twist going on. But we have these new LUTs built into the camera. You can find them online. They're in the Catalyst Browse software, which is free from Sony, and the Catalyst Browse software, you can download the LUTs that are in Catalyst Browse, so you can actually get Catalyst Browse to export those LUTs. So there's 4 new LUTs that come with Burano, are built into Burano, and of course you can load user LUTs into it as well for different looks and things like that. So the other thing, if we go back to the laptop, that a few people are asking about is different codecs the camera has and a bit more detail on them. So we'll start with XOCN. So XOCN stands for Extended Original Camera Negative. What a wonderful name. I would love to have been in the meeting where they came up with that. And somebody went, I know what we're going to call it. But it's a 16-bit compressed raw codec. It's incredibly computer friendly. I will show you the files that we shot earlier and some other files in a bit. The files are really small, and they're surprisingly small. I think this is one of the things a lot of people can't quite get their head around, is how can the files be so small? And it's an evolution of the Sony RAW codec that was first sort of seen in f/65, then f/55 cameras. And it's also the same codec that Venice 1 and Venice 2 in particular has. So, God, yes. Yeah, I'm glad most of my slides have got a black background. So it's very efficient, wow. 4K LT is 389 megabits per second. Let's try and move through these slides quite quickly. A little bit more black in this one. The smaller image at the bottom is 4K ProRes. So what's interesting about this, if we look at 4K ProRes 444XQ, and you compare the 4K ProRes to the XOCN LT at 8.6K, the XOCN is smaller than the 4K ProRes. And that's because RAW is very, very efficient, and the XOCN codec is very efficient. So you can shoot in 4K, or you can shoot in 8K. And I'll tell you right now, in my opinion, that 8K footage, the quality of that 8K is going to be much better than the ProRes 4K. So it's not that onerous. I mean, even if you go down to the ProRes 422, is 760 megabits per second. Your 8K is only twice as big as that. So an 8K file is actually, in terms of pixels, 4 times bigger, but you're only actually 2 times greater in terms of your file size for a 16-bit linear recording with incredible flexibility. If you drop down to the 6K, what you'll actually find, if I've got 6K in here somewhere, did I include 6K? I should have included the 6K, I didn't. Oh yeah, well the 6K is in here anyway. You'll see the 6K XOCN is roughly half the size of the 8K XOCN. A 6K file, in terms of how many pixels you've got, is half of an 8K file. So if we go back to this dazzlingly bright slide and extrapolate that back, 8K XOCN 1.6, 1,600 megabits per second. So the 6K is half of that. That'll be around about 800 megabits per second, which is about the same size as ProRes ordinary 42 ProRes HQ in 4K. And I know which one of those I'd much rather work with, the 6K XOCN, every time. So it's not something to be scared of in terms of file size. It really isn't. Yes, if you're used to shooting with XAVC at class 300 at 300 megabits per second, it is a bigger file. But it's not mad. Just as some other examples here, 1 hour of 4.5K ARRI 35 ARRI RAW is 1.6, yes, 1.6 terabytes. Whereas you can shoot 1 hour of 8K XOCN LT, and it's only 780 gigabytes. So it's half the size. Much, much more manageable. And higher resolution, same bit depth, very high quality. So it's a very, very efficient codec, very easy to work with. That's a bit easier to look at. So we have the other codecs in the camera. We have XAVC HI, and that has 2 quality levels. This is an H.265 codec, and the XAVC HI records at 8K. And we can record that in the high quality at 1.2 megabits per second. So this is a bit bigger than a 4K ProRes file. Then we have XAVC HI SQ, that's the standard quality level, 800 megabits per second. So that 8K file is roughly the same size as a 4K ProRes 422 HQ file. And then we have XAVC HL, which is long GOP, only available in 16:9, but it's 8K 16:9 and 520 megabits per second, so this is smaller than a 4K ProRes 422 HQ file. Very, very efficient codec. To work with the XAVC HL, you do need a pretty good computer. My MacBook Pro here will handle it quite well. It's generally a real-time edit. For most things, I can have a couple of layers of it and it will work in real time. But actually, the XOCN, I find a much easier codec to work with on this same computer because it's not a long GOP codec. It's not using a lot of this fancy technology that H.265 uses. So overall, generally, I prefer working with the XOCN. It is a bigger file, but it is my preference. It's the one that I prefer to work with. And that's, again, which codecs work at which frame size. And of course, you have the UHD XAVC-I and XAVC-L codecs in the camera as well. Somebody's asked, why don't we have H.265 in 4K with the H.265 codec? I don't know, is the answer. Maybe that's something that possibly could come later on in a firmware update. I don't know. Dual ISO, so the camera shoots at 800 and 3200 ISO with the XOCN. So you really can shoot in very, very low light levels with the camera. So let's bring the camera up rather than dazzling everybody. There we go, that's better. If I swap the camera now to the high base ISO, I'm going to do it, trying to think this is the quickest way, easiest way to do it. Because I've got to remember whether I'm using an FX3 or using this. So the easiest way will be from the home menu. I can go to here, change my base ISO, set. Right, so I'm now in high base ISO. And let's see exactly how dim this will go. The problem is going to be there's so much light coming from the screen. And then I can take the ND filter out because there's an ND filter in. And the screen is going to give me way more light than I actually need. But just to give you an idea of how sensitive the camera is, 3200 ISO. Look at that. Got this handsome gentleman in the corner there. You know, shooting in ridiculously low light levels is not a problem with this camera. And if you look at the noise, the grain, we're actually overexposed. It's ridiculous. It does help that this is a very fast lens. So I am at, I'm at 1.5. Yeah, 1.5, T1.5. But even if I stop, let's just stop it right down. So that's, where are we at now? We are at T, where are we? Good grief, that's T16. That's mad. Even I'm impressed by that. Yeah, I can put whichever you'd like on there. What, let's just put S709? we know that S709, let's go to S709. S709, that's better, it does bring the blacks up. That's T16. But even at 3200 ISO, the amount of noise that's there is negligible. That's just nuts. That really is nuts. I mean, I know from my own experience shooting with the camera that it is incredibly good in low light, and Venice 2 is the same. And it's one of the things that a lot of filmmakers really love about Venice 2 is to be able to shoot at 3200 ISO. It has huge budget implications on a big movie. What can I say? I can't say too much. So on one of the films I worked on last year, there was a huge indoor set that represented, it was a forest basically, and it was a nighttime forest scenes were shot in this indoor set. And to create moonlight was very, very easy because all they needed was a 2.4K nanlight, the 2400B nanlight light, just up in the top of the ceiling to create moonlight. They weren't using 10Ks and big lights to create the moonlight effect because you just didn't need to. You shoot at 3200 ISO. And the whole thing is much more convincing, not just for the camera, but for the actors, because they're working in a realistically dark environment. It feels like moonlight. And it changes that the whole performance, I think, when you can shoot in light levels that are similar to what you would like to shoot in. You want to make moonlight? Shoot in moonlight. I've seen people shooting with Venice 2 outside under nothing but moonlight. Now you do, to be realistic, need a full moon. You want to shoot about 2 or 3 days either side of full moon. But if you've got clear sky, you can shoot with a Venice 2 under moonlight and get a really nice, great looking image. And yeah, if you think about it, you think how an actor behaves, or you behave in the dark. You know, you might look where you're walking and things like that because you don't want to trip over stuff and things like that. And all those subtleties of how people act and behave and perform in the dark start to come through as opposed to something that's lit brighter to resemble moonlight. So being able to shoot at this really high base ISO, 3200, without a noise penalty is quite liberating for a filmmaker to be able to do that. Now, we do know that if we take Sony's FX6, for example, that has a second base ISO of 12,800 ISO. But it's actually quite noisy at that second base ISO. It's quite different to the 800. So one of the things about these cameras, I'm going to bring these lights on so I'm not standing completely in the dark, is that the Venice 2 Burano is a dual base ISO. So the FX6 has 2 base ISOs, but Sony don't call it dual base ISO. They call it high and low base ISO. Venice 2, Venice 1, Burano, they are what Sony call dual base ISO. And the reason they're named differently is because there is no difference in dynamic range between the high and the low base ISO. It's exactly the same. And the difference in noise between the high and the low base ISO is absolutely tiny. So those 2 base ISOs are interchangeable. You just pick the one that suits what you want to shoot and use it. And you don't need to worry about, oh my God, is something going to be noisy? I need to change how I expose. And that difference, that 2-stop difference of 2.5 stops, 800 to 3,200, 800, 1600, 300, 2 stops, is actually also really useful if you're changing your frame rates during your shoot. So if you're shooting, your base rate is 24 frames per second, and then you want to have a little bit of slow motion perhaps, and you might shoot at 60 frames per second to have slow motion, that's just over 2-stop difference. You don't actually need to change your lighting, you just go up to high base ISO, shoot your slow motion, then go back to 800 ISO for everything else. You haven't suddenly got to relight everything just to change your frame rate. So it's a really key feature of these cameras that people really, really like. So let's now have a look at the XAVC and post-production. Have a look at how and what we can do with XOCN in post-production. Now, I've been working with the different flavors of this codec for many, many years, and I have to say I absolutely love working with this. So I took, well, in fact, here's the card that we shot. Here's the XOCN. Oh, hello, why is there only, oh, it's the wrong clip. Media offline. No, it isn't. Okay. There we go. So this is just straight off the card. I don't know why it's giving me the offline thing. But that's straight off the card, and as you'll see, we've got real-time playback. If I go, I did actually copy, during the break, the footage onto an external drive. And let's just dump it into the media pool here in Resolve. So here are my clips. And I can just play back those clips. I can go up to full frame. This is 8.6K on a laptop in real time. Easy. It's really a very, very easy codec to work with. So let's go to the edit room. Let's stick these clips in a timeline. I suppose I could have just grabbed them all, but let's just do it this way. So I now have my clips in my timeline. I can hit play, and they're playing. Now, in terms of my timeline, let's have a look at my timeline. Oh, he's cheating. He's only working in HD. Okay. 8K. Save. Playback. Oh, look. That works too. This is a very, very easy codec to work with. It's not something to be afraid of. And I don't have the fans going crazy on the computer. This is an M1, 16 gig of RAM even. It's not even got a huge amount of RAM. So we can do that. What about ACES? ACES slows everything down. Let's go into ACES. And we'll have ACES 1.3. Now, one of the things, if you're working with XOCN, there is an option here. If I go down here for Sony RAW somewhere, we've got Sony here, Sony RAW. Do not select Sony RAW. This is not Sony RAW, it's XOCN. You can leave the input transform as no input transform, because being a RAW codec, there is a ton of metadata in it, so DaVinci Resolve actually knows exactly what it is anyway. So interesting, so these monitors, these are P3 apparently, ST284 P3, so let's actually, or D65 P3, let's try and see if this actually works. So if I do that, ta-da, it still looks a bit oversaturated, it's not bad. But there we go. We have all the color space transforms happening for us, all very, very easy. Now this is XOCN, so this is RAW. What can I do with RAW? Well, if I go into the color room here and I go to the RAW controls, at the moment for each clip this is set to project settings, but I can actually go to clip and we can reveal what the camera was set to when the clip was shot. So we can see that the color temperature was set to 4,900. There was a slight negative tint, a tint towards green, exposure 800, sharpness, highlights, etc. But we can change those. So let's say, I'm going to look at that. So let's say we've got a bit of, what happens if I make this all brighter? So if I bring the exposure up, then obviously the shot will get brighter. Then we're going to get a bit of a highlight thing going on here, perhaps. So I could just bring the highlights down, and we could just fiddle around with those highlights. Because I'm making these adjustments as part of that raw decoding process, the quality of these adjustments is going to be exceptionally high. So this is the highest possible quality type of grading that you can get. And then obviously you can then add your nodes and do your traditional grading on top of all of this stuff. And of course it's all happening still in real time. So this was something I'm preparing for my website. So in terms of does a Burano and an Alexa look the same? So let me open up these two frames. That's a Burano graded, and then let's find the same frame from Venice. So Venice and Burano side by side. Can you tell which is which other than the fact that one says Venice and one says Burano? No, you can't. They look the same. Now, I'm going to show you something that some of you might go, hang on a minute, why would I buy a Burano? So let's just have a look at something else. So let's have a look at an FX3. Oh, look, that kind of looks the same. Burano, oops, let's try and FX3, Burano. Now, to be honest, if you do a color-matched workflow where you're using one of these charts, that is kind of what you expect, to be honest, that they're going to look more or less the same. So everyone's going, well, why the hell would I want to buy a Burano? Why don't I just buy an FX3 if they look the same? So what is the difference? If I do something really wacky with the footage, so and this is a difficult thing to show. Didn't want that one, Burano, pink push. Right, so this is, I've chosen pink. This isn't meant to look nice. This is so you can see what's going on with the image. So this is from the Burano camera, and this is looking at the textural information in the image. So how much color, chroma, and luma information is there actually in this image if we pick a particular shade and a particular hue and shift it to something totally different? And what you see is you've got lots of very fine, relatively fine textural information. You can see it on his arm here, actually. Now, if we look at what you get from an FX3, if we do the same, that's the difference between a really great codec and a compressed codec, a very highly compressed codec. You have all of these blocking artifacts. They're from the compression. And they're also probably likely from differences in the way the sensor's A to D converter and things like that works. In a moving video, all of these blocks are moving. In this is more like noise that moves. And what that means is that when you try to do something like green screen, chroma key, if you're trying to do subtractive grading and things like that, that this will grade much better than this. Your chroma key, all of those things will look much, much better. And this isn't just about resolution, because if I bring up A1, so this is another 8K camera, you have the same issue. You have this blockiness to the noise that is, especially on his face up here, going to make your grading much more challenging. You can kind of see actually his face here is almost a single tone. There's very little in the way of textural information on his face there, but here the fact that it's noisy is we have a lot more tonal information. We have a lot more texture in that face. So this is actually going to grade a lot better in post-production than this will. And that's what you're getting when you have a 16-bit codec like XOCN, is the ability to separate out different textures more readily, to be able to create a different image in post-production much more easily. Now, perhaps Sony are going to shoot me for saying this, but if all you're going to do is shoot with XAVC and stick a LUT on it, use an FX6. But if you are somebody that wants to grade, that wants to really extract the very best out of your image, to be able to push and pull and manipulate that image, you want XOCN. It makes an immense amount of difference. Yeah?
Sorry, could you show the same example with the Alexa?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
No problem. Somebody spotted it, yeah.
So that's the Alexa. It's an LF. And I can bring up Burano at the same time. There is more tonal information in the Burano than there is in the LF. The LF doesn't have the blocking because this is ARRI RAW, so there's no compression artifacts. So there isn't you don't get the blocking, you don't get the macro blocking effect. But the Burano, which is higher resolution, again it's 16-bit, has more textural information because of the higher resolution, and also I think because of the way the sensor operates. I actually think there is more textural information, you can definitely see it down here, in the Burano than there is in the ARRI. And that was an eye-opener for me, actually, when I did this test. Everybody knows the ARRIs are good. You know, if I said, oh, ARRI, you don't want an ARRI, it's rubbish, that would be an absolute lie. But actually, when I did this test, it really made me aware that this comes down to resolution. You know, when you're working even for a 4K deliverable, I mean, this image here, okay, I'm exaggerating the differences so you can see what I'm talking about. But you can see that there is a difference in the textural information between these two cameras. And if I was trying to do something like this, if I was going to do a lot of keying, compositing, especially trying to pull something out of skin tones and doing stuff like face tracking and things like that, having that extra textural information makes a big difference. And I would actually prefer the Burano over the ARRI. And we're talking about an ARRI LF, it's not a cheap camera. So, you know, there's a lot to be said for what this camera is delivering. And obviously, if I brought the Venice up on this side, it's going to look more or less the same because it's the same codec, very similar sensor, lot of very similar things. So, oops. So there is a lot to be said, and this is why very earlier on I said I've become completely convinced about wanting to shoot in 8K, even if I'm only delivering in 4K. Because having all of that extra textural information makes a difference. If you think about it, the ARRI LF, where did it go? Let me bring that LF image back up. The ARRI LF, it's a 4K sensor. So the chroma resolution is only actually about 2K. Whereas Burano, with an 8K sensor, chroma resolution is 4K. It's twice as much. It has double the chroma resolution. Even if you're delivering at 4K, that matters because the LF doesn't have 4K of chroma. It can't. The Bayer sensor just can't deliver that because of the way they work. And that is what you're seeing here because this was a color pick. I picked a color and turned it pink, a particular hue. And what you're seeing is that difference in textural information between the two cameras. And it makes a difference when you're grading. So this is, you know, why, you know, I think it's important. We've got all sorts of things in here we could have a look at. But if I bring up the ARRI, where's the final? If we bring up this, and we also bring up the Burano final again. Do they look significantly different in this? This is a basic grade. They don't look very different. There isn't some magic in that ARRI shot that is like, oh, I've got to shoot with the ARRI. But when you start grading it and really pushing it and pulling it, the Burano will hold up exceptionally well compared to the ARRI because of all the extra textual information. So, you know, how much do you want to spend on your camera? Do you want to spend 25,000 euros or do you want to spend 50,000 with LF, 60,000 euros? It's up to you. And the LF file, which is ARRI RAW, is 3 times the size of the Burano file. So it's like, because one is compressed and one isn't. So there's a huge amount to be said for what Sony are currently doing with these cameras. It's really good. This codec is just a delight to work with. We can look at shadow information. So I just took the Burano footage and brought the shadows up. It's really going to highlight differences. Let's have a look at the ARRI. Let me find the same images. So I did this a couple of different times. So let's go for shadow lift number 2. Okay, so that's the Burano. And let's have a look at the ARRI. Look at all the chroma noise in the ARRI compared to the Burano. Which one of those two would you like to grade? That is going to cause you a problem, potentially, in grade. If you are pushing things to the extreme, that is going to break before that breaks. So, and in terms of details, is there a difference? Is there more detail? There's more detail in this one. This is the Burano compared to the ARRI. This has gone quite blocky, quite blotchy, and this is that lack of chroma resolution. When you have a lower chroma resolution on the sensor, you've got to make up or guess what's in these areas. Higher chroma resolution, there is color noise in here, but it's much, much finer compared to this. And this is that lack of chroma resolution. So, yeah, it gets interesting. This was a workshop I did in Dubai. And this was a private workshop for a rental house in Dubai that were looking at buying different cameras. And they said, look, we want to compare all the different cameras. And we had the ARRI LF, we had Burano, we had Venice, we had the A1, we had the FX3, we had all of these different cameras. And they said, this is what we want to do. And I was like, oh shit, this could go really wrong. I could go in there as a Sony ambassador and we could put the LF and all these other, and the LF could come out on top, you know, and I'm like, shit. But you've got to do the test fairly, so we tried to do it as fairly as we could to not bias or favor any one camera. And what we discovered was, even for me, an eye-opener. I've done these tests before, so I was kind of, yeah, oh shit, I don't really want to do it, but I know because I've done it before that I know actually that the Sony cameras will hold their head up high and come out of the test respectfully well. They're not going to come out looking bad. Generally, what you tend to find is that unless you push things to extremes, you take any of the top-tier cameras right now, and actually none of them actually look that different. But when you start pushing it, that's when you start seeing the differences, and the Sony cameras generally come out really well. But there was a risk that the LF could have come out better. And really, I could find no reason after we did the test why you would choose an LF over a Burano. Now, the Alexa 35, we didn't have a 35. The 35, I think most people understand that the Alexa 35 perhaps does have a little bit more dynamic range. But in most real-world shooting situations, does that actually make a difference anymore? Because we have so much dynamic range with all of these cameras that generally, if you've got a highlight that's causing a problem, you'd have to have a ridiculous amount of dynamic range to resolve it. If we look at these two images, now her head is angled differently, which annoyed me afterwards because she's looking a bit more upwards on the Burano than she is on the ARRI. So we have a highlight here that we don't have here. That's not a dynamic range difference. It's just simply that highlight doesn't exist here. But if you look at the highlight on the end of her nose and to some degree the highlight up here, well, this highlight on the end of a nose isn't going to come back with either camera, and if I used an LF, it would still be a highlight on the end of a nose. It wouldn't look different. So they don't, dynamic range, yes, there's differences, but I don't think it's something that we need to be concerned about with any of the cameras that are on the market today. They're all plenty good enough. And arguably, you could, in this example here, you could say, well, actually, the Burano is seeing further into the shadows than the ARRI is, or certainly in terms of if you had to recover or pull up these shadows, you're going to get more out of this than you will out of this, because that blocky noise is going to cause you a problem. So you have to sort of not just focus on maybe highlights, maybe this highlight is a bit better here than here, but then these shadows are better here than they are here. So it's 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, really, in terms of dynamic range. But this color noise, because of the lack of chroma resolution, because one is a 4K sensor and the other is an 8K sensor, matters. And I think this was something that when I first shot with Venice 2 and using an 8K sensor for the first time was a bit of an eye-opener to me, was actually it makes a big difference, even though I'm only delivering in 4K. So I've kind of mentally decided that whatever camera I purchase next will be an 8K camera, even though my clients only want 4K content. And I did do a film a little while back for a client that we had to deliver in 8K, and we had to use a red camera to shoot that, and it was disappointing, actually. Just a lot of things I didn't really like about that camera, just taking 30 seconds to turn on, only having a single card slot so that you're constantly swapping media all the time. The color science, personally, I much prefer Sony's color science. Now, whether that's simply because I shoot with Sony all the time, possibly, I don't know, but I just felt that it was much easier to get where I wanted to be with the Sony footage in post-production than with the ARRI footage. So, right, I want to come back to the camera. So that's XOCN, post-production, and stuff like that. So I'm going to come back to the camera. So I would hope that you can see from that little demo how good this codec is, and why I kind of said earlier, alluded it to earlier, that if all you're going to shoot with is the XAVC, you're kind of not really getting the benefits that this camera has. This camera really comes to life when you shoot with that XOCN codec. So coming back to the camera now, what I want to show you is some of the other things that it has. So what about the image stabilization? So we have image stabilization with IBIS. And the great thing about IBIS is it has zero effect on your image quality, because you're not zooming into the image. What you're doing is you're actually moving the sensor physically as the camera moves. So there are gyroscopic sensors in the camera that detect shape and movement of the camera body, and they move the sensor according to how much the camera body is moving. So at the moment it's on, and if I wobble the camera a little bit, yeah, we're seeing a bit of movement. Let me turn it off. So it's in my shooting menu. Oh no, it's off. Yes, that's why it's moving. Right, so let's turn it on. And I shake the camera by a similar amount. I'm still at 3200 ISO. So I'm moving the camera. Anyone at the front can see how much I'm moving the camera, and the image, yeah, it's moving a little bit, but not by much. Now if I turn it off, we go from that with off to that with on. So it's very effective. Now, bizarrely, and this wasn't intended to be like this. This isn't something Sony intended you to do, but the camera also has a special effect mode that I call earthquake mode. So if I set the focal length to 1000 millimeters, it's going to assume that I've got a really, really long lens on it, so it needs a heck of a lot of stabilization for any amount of camera movement. So what that means is I move the camera a tiny bit, the sensor moves a lot. Earthquake! So you have the ability to actually control how much stabilization you have. And what that means, though, is being a little bit more sensible about this, is if I use 25 millimeters for this 50 millimeter lens, I can actually have less stabilization. So there's still some movement goes in there, but actually it looks a little bit more natural because for me, when you're handheld, the whole reason sometimes you shoot handheld is you want that movement. You don't want to take it all out. But because you can use focal lengths that are shorter as your stabilization setting than the actual focal length, you can tune the amount of stabilization that you have to get the effect that you want. And I think that's a really neat thing. Yeah.
Can you still do the stabilization in post as you can do in FX6?
So as far as I understand, I haven't tried this with XOCN, no you can't. But with the XAVC I codec, I believe that you still can. Where's Sebastian? Has he disappeared? He's gone. I haven't actually tried it. My understanding is XAVC, yes. XOCN, no. I don't know why. The metadata is there in the files. As far as I know, the metadata is all there in the files. So I suspect it's purely a post-production software issue. So perhaps somebody will figure out a way to do it in the future. But at the moment, no. Catalyst Browse can't do it at the moment. So that's with a PL lens. We have image stabilization. Let me just go back to low base ISO. We don't need to be at 3200 ISO anymore. Oops. Okay, and then we don't need to be at F16 anymore. Right, or T16. So that's PL mount lens. Now what I'm going to do now is to swap the lens mount. So we actually have an LF mount on here currently. So this is a wooden camera LF mount. And I'm not sure where the cap for the lens is. Nope. Okay, so we'll take the lens off. And to remove the mount, there are 6 screws. Now we do have to turn the camera off because the camera detects what mount is fitted to it when it starts up. It knows whether you've got a PL mount or an E mount on it. And it detects that as it boots up. So whenever you change the lens mount, you do need to restart the camera.
When the PL mount is off, there's a couple of pins that are exposed if you have an E mount on.
Yes.
Will that affect weather, or can the weather affect that?
No, I'll show you in a second. There are some pins that connect to the PL mount. They are absolutely, totally, completely waterproof. Weather, dust, dirt, grime proof. So you don't need to cover them. Some people have suggested putting tape over them. Don't do that because that'll leave a sticky residue on them. So just leave them. They're absolutely fine. They're the same connectors that the military use on their radio equipment and stuff like that. And the connectors themselves, I believe, are actually submersible. Don't put your Burano in a bucket of water to test that, because the rest of the camera is not submersible.
Is it a small layer that you can scratch off, or is it?
No. They're big, thick copper pins. They're just down here, and they're big lumps of copper. They're very, very rugged. So now I can put a Sony E-mount lens on the camera. So once I've taken the mount off, I have to open the E-mount. Now I can put E-mount lens on the camera, and we're now E-mount. So it's another 50 millimeter lens. So very similar looking image, but now we have the ability to use Sony's autofocus. So lens is set to autofocus, camera is now set to autofocus, and I can just touch to focus. So I can touch there, I can touch down there, I could touch on the seat. Is Andre around? Come on, Andre. We need your beautiful face for the autofocus. If I bring the ND filter back in, we can narrow down the depth of field, and then I can just touch, or if I cancel the touch tracking, the camera reverts to face tracking. So let's just go into the menu and have a look at exactly how the autofocus settings are set. No, you at the moment. Excuse me. Okay. At the moment, the only monitor that will control the touch functions on Burano are this LCD screen, or you can use the Sony monitor and control app to control the camera, and that's sort of a phone app, and then you can use your phone and touch on the phone screen.
How's the latency on that?
There is a little bit of lag on that. Now, on the FX6, no, not the FX6, the FX3, so something that's happening at the moment right now is that Sony are unifying this monitor and control app and the control protocols across all of their cameras. So previously, the Alphas used one app, and the FX3 used one app, and the FX6 was a different app. And there was just all these different apps, and they all worked differently, and none of them were the same. So monitor and control now works across all of the Sony cameras. And on the FX3 and 30, it's possible to, excuse me, it's possible to plug your phone in via a USB cable to the camera. And then you have no latency. I'm hoping that will come to this. And I'm hoping it will come to the FX6 as well. My understanding is that it should come to all of these cameras. So you'll then have...
Does it have to be a Sony phone?
No, any phone. Android, iPhone, works great with the iPhones. So hopefully that will happen. And then once that happens, I would expect we'll also see the Monitor Plus app work, because Monitor Plus is a third-party app that does it as well. So hopefully this will come. The FX3 and those cameras can also be controlled to a large degree with port keys monitors, and you can use touch on those as well. So what I'm hoping, and please, this is not a promise, do not buy this camera based on Alister said it would work, but what I would hope will happen is that now these cameras are all getting the same protocols, that it'll become possible for Monitor Plus and people like that to actually have one app that works across all the cameras or port keys with their monitors to do this with other touchscreen devices. It's not a promise. It really, really isn't a promise, and it might take a while, but hopefully that's what will come. Certainly Sony are making big efforts to make that happen by having that single app now that works across all of the cameras. So fingers crossed. So in terms of how we're set right now, so we are set to very fast 5 transition speed, subject sensitivity is set to very responsive, focus area is set to wide, so that's the whole frame pretty much, only the tiniest strip around the outside. Human priority AF and tracking AF touch in MF. So let's just start, actually, I'm going to start looking at this touch in MF function, because this is actually really useful. So touch in MF, how does that work? What does that do? So if I turn the camera to manual focus, I'm now focusing manually. So the camera focuses manually, but it does mean that at any point that I want to, I can just touch the screen and it would go straight to autofocus. So that's touch in MF. There is also spot focus in MF. And this is particularly useful. So let's say you're doing an interview with the camera, your interviewee sat down and you just want to focus on the interviewee, you just do that and it's a one-hit focus. Camera is now focused. It will not change focus now. It's not going to hunt, it's not going to do anything weird halfway through the interview. It's focused, and if I just wanted to check, is it still in focus, I could just touch the screen again. And you're not going to see anything nasty unless it has actually for some reason gone out of focus. So this is a really nice thing to have. If I need to go to autofocus, I can just switch the switch and I'm straight back to face autofocus and face tracking. Now, at the moment, we're set to very responsive. So if I touch on another part of the image with the touch tracking, it will very quickly focus. If I cancel the touch tracking, it'll very quickly come back to Andre's face because it's set to human priority. If I go off the shot, it's focused on there very quickly. I come back, it's going to pick up on Andre's face very quickly. Everything's going to happen very, very fast. Now, I do, of course, have the ability, I know a lot of you already know about this stuff, I could change the responsiveness. So if I go to locked on, and I now track off Andre, and I come back to him, oh, no, it didn't stay. Okay. Stay. No, it doesn't like it. Let's focus on there, come away, come back. Yeah. So basically with locked on, if I cancel the tracking, and it's locked on to something else, if I was to walk through the shot, oh, hang on a minute. That's very disappointing. No, it would, no, I mean, generally if I walk through the shot, do something like that, the focus won't change. And that's what you'd expect. I mean, if I put my hand in front of the shot, interesting. Okay. Yeah, that's not quite what I normally see with these cameras. If I take the transition speed, as somebody has pointed out, if I slow the transition speed down, but that's kind of cheating because it's obviously going to change how quickly it focuses. But it's definitely not staying locked on. Okay. I'm not sure what's going on today, why it's not doing what it normally does. When I shot all the demo films with this camera, it behaved exactly as I had expected, which is once it's locked on, it stays locked on and you can have somebody else walk through the shot and the camera won't move. Today it's decided it's not going to do that. If I go to fast transition speed and responsive, what we should see is very different performance. As soon as I do that, bang, bang. Crash zoom for you, very easy crash zoom. Hand too close to the camera. So that's fast and fast. If we go to locked on, there we go, it's working now. It's not moving to my hand. There we go. I don't know what that was, why that was, but now it's staying locked on. Yeah. Okay, so maybe there is a little bit of a bug in there that needs to be. Yeah, it shouldn't make a difference though. Yeah. Anyway, that's what I expect. When it's on locked on, it stays focused on the subject without changing. So it is now doing what I expected, which is staying locked on. So the autofocus is very programmable. You can really sort of tell it what you want to do. and then it will behave in that way. Now, the other thing we do have, though, now is human priority, which is what this camera is set to. So, Andre, would you mind standing up for me? Okay, so obviously face tracking is obvious. It's going to track Andre's face. So turn around for me, please. Aha. So now we have, oh, look at that. It realizes that Andre is a human being, even from behind. Well, we're led to believe. So this is actually quite, thank you, you may sit down. This is quite a big improvement, actually, because especially if you're following somebody, if you're doing a fly-on-the-wall documentary, something like that, because they don't always face the camera. They will often turn away from the camera. So you don't want the camera to suddenly go off and focus somewhere else every time they turn away from the camera. And the camera can recognize just the general profile of a human being, whether it's the side, their back. It varies depending on how big they are in the frame, but it's actually really good at identifying people, just generally. Now, something, of course, that will upset the camera is, if I turn the camera around, which way have I got to go so I don't tangle my cables up? And I do that, then obviously it's like, oh, which face shall I focus on? Because there's lots of faces here. But then there's a little joystick on the side of the camera. I can select which face using this joystick. If you have the optional hand grip, there is a joystick on the hand grip. If you use the FX9 top handle, there's a joystick on that. And you can choose which face is in focus. Ah, yeah. It's recognizing a human as opposed to a face. When it's a rectangle like that, it's human tracking. But again, in terms of light levels and things like that, it will work down to very, very low light levels. So it doesn't necessarily even have to be super bright for the autofocus to work. Okay, let's come back round here. So we have variable ND filter. In fact, the ND filter is in. Forget how sensitive this camera is. You have the variable ND filter. Oh, and I just used the focus assist function there. So one of the things that you can do, if I turn off the human priority, I can do a pull focus. So I can pull focus to the flowers, turning the focus ring. If I want to go to the lights that are on the table, I can focus on the lights. And the camera will allow me to override the autofocus temporarily. And then it will stay focused on whatever it is that I've chosen. So go back to the flowers. I could focus on Andre. And now the autofocus will carry on focusing on Andre. So if Andre, if you were to come closer to the camera now, because that's what I've chosen, it stays focused on him. There, so far. And then I could just pull focus back to the flowers rather than Andre. So the AF assist function allows you to determine where the autofocus focuses. Now, it has to be a fairly obvious thing within your shot, because otherwise the camera will be a bit confused. You can't just sort of say, well, I'm going to focus on the teeniest, tiniest thing in the shot, because it will tend to favor the larger parts of the shot. But it does give you some control to do pull focuses on the fly while you're working just using the focus ring, while still having autofocus. So again, it's one of these things that, I know there are alternative cameras that you could choose right now to Burano, but you have to think about that package. What are you buying when you buy the camera? What is it that you're getting? What are you paying for? You have this wonderful codec. You have this great ability to grade this material. You have 8K high resolution. You also have XAVC. So if all you need to do is to shoot in 4K, you can do that. But on top of that, you have this really great autofocus that makes it very, very easy to work with the camera if you use Sony lenses. You have IBIS that works with PL lenses as well as the Sony lenses. And so many things that make this a very easy camera to work with. Now, if I change out of XAVC, change out of XOCN, and I'm going to go now to the compressed codecs. So quickest way actually is from quick menu. So I'm going to go, in fact I am in XAVC, but if I go down now to, let's go down to Super 35 5.8K. And then now we're in XAVC I is my codec. You can see I still have stabilization. It's set to standard. I can wobble the camera about, and we have a similar amount of stabilization to before. But now we can actually start bringing in the next level of stabilization. And this works with PL lenses as well, actually. So we can go with an E-mount lens, we can go from standard to active. With a PL lens, it's denoted as going from low to high. And now we have a really, okay, eventually it goes, but we have a tremendous amount of image stabilization. So if I take the camera off the tripod, it likes the flowers. Okay, so I can use the AF assist here. I can just tell it, I don't want to focus on the flowers, I want to focus on Andre. And I can get a shot that almost looks like it's on a tripod, handheld. Now, with the active mode, what you do get, the thing I have, reason why I possibly wouldn't use it is it's very stable until it isn't. So it tends to stay stable, and if I start wobbling the camera around, eventually it hits the point where it can't stabilize, and you get that sort of jerky thing. But if you were shooting from a boat, shooting from a car or an aeroplane, doing something like that, it's a really useful mode to have. Okay, I've gone down to Super 35 to get that mode, but that's still a 5.8K capture. It's Super 35. It's not like I've had to go to some very, very highly cropped image. It's still a perfectly reasonable thing. And again, with PL lenses, you have in this, at Super 35, you can go to the high level of stabilization and have a similar thing with PL lenses. So it's not just E-mount lenses. So there is a tremendous amount that we can do depending on the lenses that we're doing, but there is a crop into the image when you do use this active or high amount of stabilization, and it only works with the compressed with the XAVC codec, because this is an electronic process and you can't apply an electronic process to RAW. It's not something you can do in camera. So that's one of the limitations of it, yes?
Does the active only look at the image, or is it the gyroscope?
It's doing both. So the gyroscopic sensors, from what I understand about it, the gyroscopic sensors are moving the sensor. So the IBIS is doing the IBIS side of it, and then it's looking at the image and what the result of that is, and then stabilizing it still further electronically.
Because sometimes when your subject is moving and you're really close, then it thinks it's still, so then the whole image starts wobbling.
Yes, I mean, many years ago, I had a problem. I film severe weather, extreme weather. I had a dash-mounted camera, and we were chasing hurricanes, and the image stabilizer was working great until I turned the windscreen wipers on, and then it would see the windscreen wipers as being still, and the rest of everything else moving. So the whole shot was doing that, as the windscreen wipers were going across the screen. So with this, let's have a look. So if we go to active, I don't think I've not got a huge amount of cable here. Could you come closer to me? That's it. Yeah, it's velcroed on a little bit more. Yeah. So the issue is that if you move a little bit, Andre, just I don't see anything obvious. Oh, is it? No, it's actually set to auto. So when you put an E-mount lens on, it will detect the lens and set that. The default is auto, and it has detected that this is a 50mm lens. So if I go back to here, you can see it says 50mm up at the top left. So it knows what the lens is. So generally with the E-mount lenses, it will read the focal length information from the lens and set that automatically. With if you've got the Sony PL mount on and you're using a lens that supports lens data, generally it will read the PL lens focal length as well. But you can turn the auto off to manually override that and put in your own focal length if you want. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, this is don't work with the HDMI codec.
No, because this is actually manipulating the image electronically. So this doesn't work with the raw codec. And the same with things like, thank you, René, Andre. The same with things like breathing compensation. That will only work with the compressed codecs because it's an electronic image manipulation. You can't do that electronic image manipulation to something that's raw. So some of those things, a lot of the lens compensation stuff, a lot of the breathing compensation will not work with XOCN because it's raw. Yeah.
How durable are these gyroscopes? I'm worried they might move, and what does this mean potentially in the future for backfocusing?
Yeah, so I know that this was something that on the pre-production, the prototype cameras, we did notice that there could be, in certain circumstances, changes to the back focus. You never noticed it with an E-mount lens, but we did notice a couple of times that we'd put a PL lens on the camera, we would set it up, check the back focus, come back the next day, turn the camera on, and it was very slightly different. So we fed that back to Sony, and Sony made some changes internally, or did something to the camera, I don't know what exactly, but they made some changes to eliminate that. So when the camera is turned off, the sensor is actually held in place, or if the IBIS is turned off, it's magnetically clamped into place, and it can't move. So you always have the option to turn IBIS off, but I believe that they've done a lot of work to make sure that there is no back focus change because of the IBIS. Yeah.
How rigid is it, the sensor, if you were to switch off the IBIS and use it on a car mount?
Yeah, so I've not ever found it to move in anything that I've done with it so far. But I do know.
Did you test it in rough conditions? Like,
oh, we've had it in cars and vehicles with hard mounts in cars and things like that, and we've never ever noticed the sensor moving. I do know from experience, though, and this doesn't necessarily just affect cameras, that certain audio frequencies, if it's loud enough, can set up a vibration within the body of a camera. So if shooting a rock festival, a music event, if the bass of the music is loud enough, I've seen some other cameras with IBIS where the sensor's it's probably the sensor that's moving. It's vibrating in time with the music. You can see it like a ripple going through the shot in time with the music. I've not been able to test that with Burano, so I don't know. But also, by the time you get to that point, you're also getting to the point where it starts affecting the lens as well. So if sometimes you'll get the elements in the lens start to vibrate and things like that. I mean, this is seriously freaking loud. So there is the potential, I believe, for something to happen, but I haven't ever seen it yet on a Burano. And I don't believe, I have not heard from anybody else that's heard about it either.
Could you tell a little bit more about the technique used for the optical stabilization in comparison to the A7S, for instance?
It's the same process with IBIS, is that there are gyroscopic sensors in the camera that detect how the camera is moving, and then there are what's called piezoelectric actuators on the sensor that move the sensor in time with that actual movement of the cameras. Now, a piezoelectric actuator, when you actually look at one, looks like a solid piece of almost like a ceramic material. So it's not like an arm or a servo or motors and gears. It's a material that actually can, when you pass an electric current through it, expands or contracts. So when it's off, that material, as well as the magnetic clamping, doesn't move anyway naturally. So it's not like it's really floppy or loose. I mean, when the camera is off, you may see the sensor at an odd angle when you look in through the optical port, and that's just in its clamped resting position. But as soon as you turn it on, it's brought into place by these piezoelectric actuators. It is basically the same system that is in the A7S III and the small cameras. But what's different, so there were several challenges to making this work in a camera like this. And the biggest one that as a filmmaker, something that's really important to us is that the camera doesn't overheat. You need to be able to shoot continuously all day long. You might be shooting a concert, something like that might go on for a couple of hours, and you might be rolling continuously for those 2 hours, which with the dual card slot you can easily do, because as one card fills up, you can put an empty one in and just carry on rotating through your cards. You could be shooting for many hours. If you tried to do that with an A7S or most of those small cameras, they're going to overheat and it will shut down eventually. With the bigger cameras, if you look at the sensor on a Venice, it has huge fins on the back of the sensor. That's a heat sink, and air is passed over those fins to keep the sensor at a constant temperature. Now, this is one of the things actually that's quite critical about all of this, is that the sensor is actually allowed to get hot. So when you turn the camera on, initially, you'll hear the fan very quick, spins up very quickly while the camera boots. But once the camera is on, initially the fan speed is very low, and the sensor is allowed to get hot. And then the black balance calibration for your camera, if you ever do a black balance or anything like that, you do it when the camera's hot. And then that sensor is allowed to run hot. And the reason behind that is you can't cool a sensor below the ambient temperature unless you actually have refrigeration in the camera. And that would be bulky and too heavy and just a crazy thing to have. You use a lot of power if you use electronic active cooling. So the sensor's allowed to run relatively hot so that you can use the camera in a hot environment and the camera's sensor temperature can be still maintained constant. And the key thing about maintaining a constant temperature is black balance doesn't change, noise doesn't change, all of the calibration of the camera doesn't change. So if you allow the sensor to run at 60 degrees, you could be shooting in somewhere it's 50 degrees and still keep it at 60 degrees. So you let it run hot, but you keep it at a constant high temperature. That becomes a challenge on a small camera to allow it to run that hot, because to keep it at that constant temperature, you need a big heat sink on the back of the sensor so that you can control the heat. With IBIS, you can't have a heat sink on the back of the sensor because the sensor becomes too heavy to be moved quickly enough to stabilize the shot. And this was always the big challenge for IBIS. This was the biggest challenge, that on a professional level camera, like a Venice level, Burano level camera, is you want that temperature control over the sensor, but you can't have heat sinks on it because it becomes too heavy for the IBIS system. So what Sony have developed for Burano is a flexible heat pipe that's on the back of the sensor that can transfer the heat from the sensor to a remote heat sink, and they can control the temperature of the remote heat sink, and then the heat pipe, which is flexible enough to allow the IBIS to work, keeps the sensor at that temperature that you want. So this is a new technology that's in Burano. Then the other issue became, well, if we're passing a ton of air over these heat sinks and everything else, we've got to make sure that dust can't get onto the sensor. So the sensor needs to be sealed, but it also has to move. If you think of the FX3, the A7S III and those cameras, the front of the sensor is open. There's nothing in front of it. There's no ND filter system. There's none of that. So you can clean the sensor. So if it gets dusty, you can get your blower out and you can blow the dust off. And the FX3 has a fan in it. But that fan doesn't matter that it blows dust onto the sensor because the sensor can be cleaned. So they also, for Burano, had to develop a system where you can have the ND filter in front of the sensor behind it, you can have the cooling air, but you have to still be sealed between the ND filter and the sensor. So they had to develop new seals and new ways of sealing the camera and the sensor. So that was the second thing they had to do. And the other thing was actually make the ND filter much thinner to allow the sensor to move. So there's a lot of things that have gone into Burano to make all of this work. There's these new flexible seals to keep the dust out. There's a thinner ND filter to make sure that, to allow the sensor to move. And then there is this heat pipe to keep the heat constant so that your calibration, you don't have to keep black balancing all the time and everything like that, and your image won't change even if you shoot for hours at a time. So some really big changes over what's come before gone into Burano to make all of that work. Did that answer your question? Well, I can't remember what the original question was. That's the problem. So on the sensor, there are extra photo sites that are outside of the visible area that are masked, and they're constantly measuring the black level of those pixels, and that is used then to calibrate black balance actively on the sensor. So you don't have to black balance it. One of the nice things about the Sony cameras is you don't have to keep black balancing them all the time. Yes, but I've got time for questions, so yes.
Question about the IBIS.
Yes.
When you would track, let's say, a Formula 1 car.
Yes.
You're gonna do this, right? So
Yeah.
how can you switch off the horizontal and vertical?
No, you can't individually switch off horizontal and vertical. It's either on or off. I know exactly where you're coming from with that. If we go back to, let's see, where are we set at the moment? We're set, let's turn the active off. Just go to standard stabilization. If I start a quick pan and stop, let me just check I have got, yeah, steady shot standard. So yeah, I've got steady shot in. You can see that it's taking that wobble out. But actually, what you don't get, the programming of it is very good. You don't get that at the end of your move where you sort of, it is there. If you look very closely, you can just about see the images moving. There, you can see it there. But it's so subtle, I really don't think it's a problem. It was something that worried me because I've had previous cameras that are IBIS and things like that, and if you shoot, you're trying to, static shot, car comes into the shot, suddenly you're trying to pan it, and it's like, well, either the camera's catching up or when you stop, the camera does catch up. It makes it difficult. And I actually found it not to be a problem with Burano. When we did the Sum of One film, lots of the movement when we're moving the camera or the actors are moving, the dancers, there was no problem at all following them. And we did some long shots with 150 and 250 millimeter lenses of people running. There's a tracking shot through the trees, no problem at all. It was not an issue.
You do get a 5-axis stabilization when you use Sony?
Yes, yeah, yeah. So any more questions? Yes?
You hot swap when you're using these regular V-mounts without like a shark fin or something like this?
So it's a standard V-mount on the back of the camera, so it's down to whatever your battery system is. So if you have a shark fin that is hot swap compatible, you'll be able to use that. There's no internal power, no. There's nothing inside the camera to power it when it doesn't have external power. I'm a big fan of the PAG stacking batteries because you can stack them together, multiple batteries, and what I tend to do is I have a little, it's about 50 watt-hour battery, it's only about that thick on the back of the camera, and then I put the 100s or 150s on the back of that so I can hot swap throughout the day. V-mount, yes. They do V and gold mount in that system, yeah. They do both V and gold. The camera is V-mount, but you can obviously put an adapter to gold mount on it. Any more questions? Yeah, at the back?
The SDI out ports being linked, is that because of the
camera hardware or because of the firmware?
I honestly don't know. I'm going to guess. Let me bring up. Can we? Yeah. So this is what the camera outputs or doesn't output. And it is a complicated slide. Don't shoot me. I didn't design the camera. There are, it's no secret, there are some weird limitations. For example, when we were using the XOCN, then we have, yes, you can have HD, SDI, or HD, HDMI, but not both. And when I went to the XAVC, depends on which, if you're using XAVC I, you only have overlays on the HDMI and not on the SDI. I don't know why these limitations exist. My suspicion is that there is a lot more processing power in the HDMI path. So the HDMI signal certainly in the alpha cameras is created within the DSP, the Sony BIOS processors. And I suspect this camera shares a lot of that technology. I mean, why wouldn't you? It's actually very good technology. And they're leveraging the HDMI processors to do a lot of that stuff, and that includes image scaling. So one of the things that will come in a firmware update is that on the HDMI outputs, you will get what you see in the viewfinder, where the image is reduced in size, and then the overlays are around the image instead of over it. And that's coming, it's in the firmware roadmap, but that will only be on the HDMI. So I have to assume from that there is the extra processing required to scale the image in the HDMI path that doesn't exist in the SDI path. An SDI encoding chip, you can buy them off the shelf and you stick video into it and you get SDI out. And there's probably a couple of those in this camera for the SDIs. Whereas for HDMI, it tends to be more of something that is custom built for the application. And I suspect that there is just simply a lot more processing power in the HDMI path than there is in the SDI path, which is why just overall the HDMI seems to be able to do a lot more in this camera than the SDI can. It's frustrating, it is. Having shot with the camera a lot now, it almost never actually gets in the way. How often on a shoot would you be switching between XOCN and XAVC? Probably not very often. Your project is probably either going to be one that you're going to shoot in XOCN or it's going to be one that you shoot in XAVC. And in fact, if you're shooting in XAVC, then yes, you're going to have to use HDMI for if you want overlays. The SDI is clean, but actually that could play in your favor because you can have an HDMI with overlays and a clean SDI. So it's not all bad, but it does depend on what you're doing. Sony are obviously aware of the situation. They monitor the forums and the user groups. They listen to what's being said. They are just a bit slow to change sometimes. I don't know what will come in future firmware, how much of this stuff can be changed by firmware or is innate in the hardware. I don't know. Yes, a couple in the green. Sorry. Well, I'll take the false color one first. I doubt it. The only camera in all of Sony's lineup that has false color is Venice. It's the only one. Now, having said that, again, the Monitor and Control app from Sony has false color. And Monitor Plus has false color. So there are ways of doing it. Most monitors have false color, to be honest, these days. There's very few monitors that don't have false color. It would be nice if it was in the camera, I agree, but I don't think it's the end of the world that it's not.
There's also, I've seen on a video, you can download a lot.
Yes. Yeah, but then you can't have an ordinary LUT. Yeah, yeah, but that is one way of doing it. Yes. Yes.
Does it detect your output, or do you have to manually switch?
You have to manually switch your output. Yes, you go into the menu, and there's a couple of different menu pages where you can change your different output options. No? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming. Great to see a big turnout like this. I'll be around a little bit. I think there is beer arriving, I'm led to believe. Yes.